The Blackwater Canyon Mauling. The morning of May 6, 2025, dawned crisp and clear over the Helena National Forest in Montana, with temperatures hovering around 42 degrees Fahrenheit and a light westerly wind carrying the scent of pine and melting snow down from the Continental Divide. Dr. Sarah Michelle Hendricks, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist from Colorado State University, stood on the wooden deck of the Blackwater Canyon Research Station, sipping her second cup of coffee and watching the sun paint golden streaks across the densely forested valley below. The research station, established in 1987 and situated at an elevation of 4,800 feet, served as a training facility for park rangers, wildlife researchers, and conservation officers from across the northwestern United States. Sarah had arrived 3 days earlier as part of a 2-week intensive program focusing on large predator behavior and human-wildlife conflict resolution. The facility itself was a collection of rustic log buildings connected by gravel pathways, nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and Engelmann spruce. The main lodge housed the dining hall, lecture rooms, and administrative offices, while smaller cabins provided sleeping quarters for up to 30 participants. A network of well-maintained trails radiated out from the station, leading to observation blinds, research plots, and scenic overlooks throughout the 15,000-acre preserve. The Blackwater Creek meandered through the valley floor, its waters running clear and cold as they carved their way toward the Missouri River drainage system 50 miles to the east. Sarah had been looking forward to this program for months. Her doctoral research focused on grizzly bear denning behavior in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and the opportunity to learn from some of the most experienced bear researchers in North America was invaluable. The program's director, Dr. Marcus Robert Thompson, was a legend in the field, a 62-year-old former National Park Service ranger who had spent over 3 decades studying grizzly bears in Alaska, Montana, and Alberta. His weathered face bore the scars of countless wilderness expeditions, including a distinctive claw mark across his left cheek from a too-close encounter with a sow defending her cubs in Glacier National Park in 1998. Thompson had assembled an impressive roster of instructors and participants for this particular session. Among them was Jennifer Lynn Martinez, a 41-year-old supervisory park ranger from Yellowstone National Park, who had personally handled over 200 bear incidents during her 15-year career. Her expertise in non-lethal bear deterrence techniques and human behavior modification had made her a sought-after instructor throughout the region. Then there was David Michael Kowalski, a 38-year-old wildlife photographer and former Marine whose combat experience in Afghanistan had given him an unusual perspective on risk assessment and crisis management in dangerous situations. His photographs of grizzly bears in their natural habitat had been featured in National Geographic, Outdoor Life, and numerous conservation publications. The research station staff was equally impressive. Station manager Rebecca Ann Sullivan, a 51-year-old former emergency medical technician turned wildlife educator, had been running the facility for 8 years. Her background in emergency medicine proved invaluable given the remote location and inherent risks associated with large predator research. Assistant Manager Thomas James Brennan, a 29-year-old Montana native with a master's degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Montana, served as the primary liaison with state and federal wildlife agencies. His intimate knowledge of the local ecosystem and bear population dynamics made him an indispensable resource for visiting researchers. Among the other participants were Dr. Amanda K. Richardson, a 36-year-old veterinarian specializing in wildlife medicine from the University of California, Davis, Lieutenant Colonel James Edward Morrison, a 43-year-old Air Force survival instructor cross-training in civilian wildlife management, Maria Elena Vasquez, a 32-year-old conservation officer from the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department, and Dr. Kevin Patrick O'Brien, a 47-year-old psychologist from Denver who specialized in treating outdoor recreation trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder in first responders. The weather forecast for the week had called for typical spring conditions in the northern Rocky Mountains. Cool mornings warming to the mid-60s by afternoon, with a chance of scattered thunderstorms later in the week. The snowpack in the high country was melting rapidly, swelling the creeks and creating ideal conditions for bears emerging from winter hibernation. This timing, Thompson had explained during their first evening briefing, made it an optimal period for observing bear behavior as the animals transitioned from their winter dormancy to active foraging. However, it also represented the most dangerous time of year for human-bear encounters, as hungry bears dispersed across the landscape in search of early spring food sources. Sarah finished her coffee and checked her watch. 6:47 a.m. The day's first session was scheduled to begin at 8 a.m., with a lecture on grizzly bear seasonal behavior patterns, followed by a field exercise at one of the observation blinds 3 miles up the Blackwater Trail. She headed back inside the cabin she shared with Dr. Richardson and Maria Vasquez, gathering her field notebook, camera, binoculars, and day pack. The morning air carried a hint of moisture that suggested possible precipitation later in the day, so she added a rain jacket and extra layers to her pack. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah made her way to the main lodge for breakfast, joining the familiar group of researchers and instructors who had become her colleagues over the past few days. The dining hall buzzed with quiet conversation as participants reviewed their field guides and discussed the previous day's observations. Dr. Thompson sat at his usual spot near the stone fireplace, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee as he reviewed field reports from the motion-activated cameras placed throughout the preserve. "Morning, Sarah," called Jennifer Martinez from across the room, her voice carrying the easy familiarity that develops quickly among people sharing intense outdoor experiences. "Ready for today's adventure in the field?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically as she loaded her plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, and sourdough toast from the buffet line. "Absolutely. I'm particularly interested in observing the Denning site recovery behavior Dr. Thompson mentioned yesterday." David Kowalski looked up from his equipment bag, where he was checking camera batteries and memory cards. "I've got the telephoto lens ready for some long-distance observation. After hearing about that sow with cubs spotted near Trail Ridge last week, I'm hoping we might get some incredible shots today." Dr. Thompson's voice carried across the dining hall as he addressed the group. "Before we head out this morning, I want to remind everyone about the bear activity reports from the past 48 hours. Our remote cameras have documented increased movement patterns throughout the valley, with at least 3 different adult bears active in the sector we'll be visiting today. One appears to be a large male, possibly the same individual we catalogued as Bear 247 last season, estimated weight around 650 pounds, with distinctive scarring on his right shoulder from what looks like an old territorial dispute. Rebecca Sullivan, who was refilling coffee carafes, added, "The weather station recorded temperatures dropping to 28 degrees last night, which likely triggered increased foraging behavior as the bears seek to replace calories burned during the cold snap. Everyone needs to be extra vigilant about noise discipline and scent management today." As the group finished breakfast, Thomas Brennan distributed the day's equipment manifest and safety protocols. Each participant would carry a GPS unit, emergency whistle, bear spray, and personal locator beacon. The group would travel in pairs, maintaining visual contact at all times, with predetermined rally points established along the trail route. Dr. Thompson would lead the expedition, with Jennifer Martinez serving as the sweep, ensuring no one fell behind or became separated from the group. At 8 a.m. sharp, the group of 12 assembled on the lodge's front porch for the final safety briefing. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the light frost that had formed on the wooden railings and casting long shadows across the research station's grounds. Dr. Thompson, dressed in well-worn hiking pants, a faded flannel shirt, and a canvas vest filled with field equipment, addressed the group with the gravity that comes from decades of experience in dangerous wilderness situations. Today's objective is to reach Observation Blind Charlie, located approximately 2.8 miles northeast of our current position along the Blackwater Trail, Thompson began, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. The trail gains about 800 feet of elevation over that distance, passing through prime grizzly habitat, including several known feeding areas and travel corridors. Our cameras have documented significant bear sign along this route within the past 72 hours, including fresh scat, claw marks on trees, and overturned logs indicating active foraging. He paused to scan the faces of his audience, making eye contact with each participant. I cannot overemphasize the importance of following our established protocols today. We are entering the territory of one of North America's most powerful predators during their most active and potentially unpredictable season. Bears emerging from hibernation are hungry, territorial, and may be accompanied by cubs, which dramatically increases the risk of aggressive encounters. Jennifer Martinez stepped forward to demonstrate the proper use of bear spray, removing a canister from her belt holster and explaining the effective range, wind considerations, and deployment techniques. Remember, bear spray is most effective at distances of 10 to 15 feet, she said, holding the canister at arm's length and demonstrating the proper grip and stance. If you're forced to use it, aim slightly downward to compensate for the spray pattern and be prepared to back away immediately after deployment. Do not turn and run unless you have no other choice, as this can trigger a predator chase response. Dr. Richardson raised her hand with a question about the medical implications of bear spray exposure on humans, leading to a detailed discussion of first aid procedures and evacuation protocols. The group's emergency communication plan relied on satellite phones and personal locator beacons, with backup procedures involving signal mirrors and emergency flares in case of equipment failure. The nearest hospital with trauma capabilities was Providence St. Peter Hospital in Helena, approximately 47 miles by road from the research station, with a helicopter landing zone cleared and marked just 200 yards from the main lodge. At 8:32 a.m., the group set out along the Blackwater Trail, their boots crunching softly on the frost-covered gravel path that wound through the timber. The trail had been constructed in the 1970s by the Forest Service using hand tools and pack animals, following natural contours and game trails to minimize environmental impact. Wooden bridges spanned several seasonal creek crossings, while strategically placed culverts managed drainage during snowmelt and heavy precipitation. Sarah found herself hiking alongside Maria Vasquez, the conservation officer whose knowledge of local wildlife populations provided fascinating insights into the ecosystem they were traversing. This entire drainage has seen a remarkable recovery in grizzly bear populations over the past 2 decades, Maria explained as they climbed steadily through a stand of mature Douglas fir. When I started with Fish, Wildlife and Parks 8 years ago, we might document 15 or 20 different individuals in this area during an entire season. Last year, our genetic sampling identified over 40 distinct bears using this habitat. The trail crossed several avalanche chutes where winter snowslides had cleared wide swaths through the forest canopy, creating natural meadows rich with bear foods like glacier lilies, spring beauty, and various grasses. Dr. Thompson stopped the group at one particularly large chute to point out extensive digging sites where bears had been excavating ground squirrel colonies and unearthing bulbs and roots. The torn earth and scattered debris painted a vivid picture of the powerful digging capabilities of these massive animals. Notice the claw marks in these excavation sites, Thompson said, kneeling beside a freshly torn section of earth. The distance between individual claw marks can help us estimate the size of the bear responsible. These marks are spaced approximately 4 inches apart, suggesting a large adult, probably male, based on the depth and power of the digging. David Kowalski knelt beside Thompson, photographing the claw marks with a macro lens while Dr. Richardson took detailed measurements with a field ruler. The group spent nearly 15 minutes at this location, documenting various signs, including tracks in a muddy creek crossing, hair samples caught on the rough bark of a marking tree, and several piles of scat containing undigested vegetation and small mammal remains. As they continued along the trail, the forest canopy grew denser, filtering the morning sunlight into dappled patterns that shifted and danced with the light breeze. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached Blackwater Creek, which paralleled the trail for several hundred yards before disappearing into a narrow canyon. The creek bottom was littered with deadfall trees and massive boulders, creating a complex habitat mosaic that provided cover and foraging opportunities for numerous wildlife species. At 9:47 a.m., approximately 1.8 miles from the research station, the group paused at a designated rest stop where the trail crossed a small tributary of Blackwater Creek. This location, known as Wolverine Crossing for the occasional tracks found in the sandy creek bottom, provided an excellent vantage point for observing wildlife movement through the valley. Dr. Thompson used this opportunity to discuss bear behavior patterns and the environmental factors that influence their daily activity cycles. Grizzly bears are typically most active during the early morning and evening hours, particularly during spring when they're focused on maximizing caloric intake, he explained, gesturing toward the various habitat types visible from their position. However, bears are opportunistic and highly adaptable, so we might encounter active animals at any time of day. The key is to remain vigilant and recognize the environmental cues that indicate recent bear presence. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, whose military background had made him particularly attentive to tactical considerations, asked about defensive positioning and evacuation routes. This led to a discussion of the group's contingency plans, including predetermined rally points, communication protocols, and decision trees for various emergency scenarios. The conversation revealed the careful planning that had gone into every aspect of the day's expedition, from equipment redundancy to medical evacuation procedures. At 10:15 a.m., the group resumed their hike toward Observation Blind Charlie, following the trail as it switchbacked up a steep hillside through a mixed conifer forest. The elevation gain became more noticeable at this point, and several participants paused to adjust their clothing layers as their exertion level increased. The trail surface changed from gravel to native soil, compacted by decades of use, with occasional sections of wooden planking installed to prevent erosion on the steepest grades. Sarah noticed that the forest understory had changed significantly as they gained elevation. The lush ferns and devil's club of the lower elevations gave way to huckleberry bushes, mountain ash, and scattered wildflowers. Dr. Thompson explained that this transition zone between forest communities was particularly attractive to bears, offering diverse food sources within a relatively small area. He pointed out several berry patches that would become crucial feeding areas later in the summer, as well as ant-infested logs that provided an important protein source for emerging bears. The group's pace had settled into a steady rhythm, with brief stops every 20 to 30 minutes for observation, documentation, and rest. The morning was progressing according to schedule, and the participants were engaged and enthusiastic about the learning experience. Dr. O'Brien, the trauma psychologist, had been documenting the group's stress responses and decision-making processes as part of his research into outdoor recreation psychology. His observations would later prove invaluable in understanding the sequence of events that followed. At 10:52 a.m., approximately 2.3 miles from the research station and still 500 yards from their destination, David Kowalski spotted movement in a clearing roughly 150 yards ahead and slightly uphill from the trail. He raised his hand for silence and pointed toward the disturbance, his photojournalist instincts immediately focused on the potential wildlife encounter. The group froze in place as Dr. Thompson raised his binoculars to scan the area Kowalski had indicated. "Bear," Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible as he confirmed the sighting. "Adult grizzly appears to be foraging in that avalanche chute. Everyone slowly back away from the trail edge and group up behind those large firs." The next few moments unfolded with the careful choreography of experienced wildlife observers. Each participant slowly and quietly moved to the designated cover position, removing day packs and preparing binoculars and cameras for observation. The bear appeared unaware of their presence, methodically working through the debris field of the avalanche chute as it searched for ground squirrels and root vegetables. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the distinctive features that marked this as a mature grizzly bear. The animal's massive shoulder hump, dished facial profile, and long, curved claws were clearly visible as it moved through the clearing with surprising grace for such a large creature. Its coat was the rich brown color typical of Rocky Mountain grizzlies, with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the morning sunlight. The bear's estimated weight appeared to exceed 500 pounds, marking it as a large, adult male. Dr. Thompson whispered instructions for the group's observation protocol, assigning specific documentation responsibilities to each participant. Sarah was tasked with recording behavioral observations, while Dr. Richardson would note any visible health indicators or physical characteristics. David Kowalski would photograph the encounter, and Maria Vasquez would record GPS coordinates and environmental conditions. The remaining participants would maintain security watch, scanning for additional bears or changes in the observed animal's behavior. For nearly 20 minutes, the group watched in fascination as the grizzly demonstrated the foraging behaviors they had been studying in their classroom sessions. The bear used its powerful claws to overturn logs weighing several hundred pounds, exposing ant colonies and beetle larvae beneath. It systematically worked through a section of the avalanche debris, occasionally pausing to sample vegetation or investigate interesting scents carried on the morning breeze. "Notice how he's working into the wind," Thompson observed quietly. "That's typical behavior that allows him to monitor for threats or opportunities upwind while focusing on foraging activities. His body language indicates he's relaxed and focused on feeding, which is ideal for our observation purposes." The bear's movements were methodical and efficient, demonstrating the intelligence and adaptability that had enabled grizzly bears to survive in challenging mountain environments for thousands of years. Sarah filled several pages of her field notebook with behavioral observations, noting the animal's feeding patterns, movement sequences, and response to environmental stimuli. The encounter was providing exactly the kind of real-world learning experience that made field programs like this invaluable for wildlife professionals. At 11:17 a.m., the situation began to change. The bear suddenly stopped foraging and raised its massive head, nostrils flaring as it tested the air for scents. Its ears rotated forward in an alert posture, and its body language shifted from relaxed foraging to heightened awareness. Dr. Thompson immediately recognized the significance of this behavioral change and whispered urgent instructions for the group to prepare for movement. "He's picked up our scent," Thompson said quietly. "Everyone slowly gather your gear and prepare to back away down the trail. Move deliberately, but don't make any sudden movements or noise." The bear took several steps in their direction, its head swaying from side to side as it tried to locate the source of the human scent. At this distance, the animal appeared even more imposing, its muscular frame and confident movement patterns indicating a dominant individual comfortable in its territory. The grizzly stood briefly on its hind legs, a behavior that allowed it to better scan for threats and investigate interesting scents. Maria Vasquez, whose experience with bear encounters had taught her to read the subtle signs of escalating aggression, noticed the bear's ears beginning to flatten against its skull. "Dr. Thompson," she whispered urgently, "I think we need to move now." His body language is shifting toward defensive posturing. The group began their careful retreat down the trail, maintaining visual contact with the bear while slowly increasing the distance between them and the potential threat. Standard protocol called for backing away while facing the bear, avoiding direct eye contact while keeping the animal in peripheral vision. Each participant checked that their bear spray was accessible and ready for deployment if the situation deteriorated. For several tense minutes, the bear remained in the clearing, occasionally taking a few steps toward their former position but showing no signs of aggressive pursuit. The animal appeared to be investigating the lingering human scent while deciding whether to continue foraging or move to a different area. Dr. Thompson led the group approximately 100 yards down the trail before calling a halt to assess the situation and determine their next course of action. "That was exactly the type of encounter we hoped for," Thompson said, his voice reflecting both relief and satisfaction with how the group had handled the situation. "We observed natural behavior, documented valuable data, and successfully disengaged when the bear became aware of our presence. This is a textbook example of responsible wildlife observation." The group's adrenaline levels were clearly elevated, with animated discussions about the bear's size, behavior, and the effectiveness of their observation protocols. Dr. O'Brien noted the various stress responses and coping mechanisms displayed by different participants, adding to his research on outdoor recreation psychology. Several participants were reviewing their photographs and field notes, excited about the quality of documentation they had achieved. At 11:34 a.m., Dr. Thompson made the decision to continue toward observation blind Charlie, reasoning that the bear had shown no aggressive behavior and was likely to remain in the avalanche chute for some time. The blind was positioned on a ridge approximately 400 yards from the bear's current location, providing a safe observation platform with multiple escape routes. The elevated position would also allow them to monitor the bear's movements while conducting additional learning exercises. The final half-mile to the observation blind required climbing a steep switchback trail through dense timber. This section of the route was particularly challenging, with loose rock and exposed roots, creating potential hazards for hikers carrying heavy packs and technical equipment. The group's pace slowed significantly as they navigated the difficult terrain, with frequent stops to ensure everyone remained safely together. Sarah found herself breathing heavily as the elevation gain and morning's excitement combined to challenge her cardiovascular system. The thin mountain air at nearly 5,600 feet above sea level made every step more demanding, and her day pack felt heavier with each switchback. She focused on maintaining steady breathing and secure footing while keeping an eye on Dr. Richardson, who was hiking just ahead of her. At 11:58 a.m., the group crested the ridge and caught their first glimpse of observation blind Charlie, a substantial log and stone structure built into the hillside to provide concealed viewing positions overlooking the valley below. The blind had been constructed with funds from a National Science Foundation grant in 2003, designed by wildlife architects to minimize visual impact while maximizing observation opportunities. Large windows with one-way glass provided unobstructed views of key habitat areas, while the interior featured bench seating for 12 observers and storage space for research equipment. As the group approached the blind, Dr. Thompson conducted a final security check of the area, looking for fresh bear sign or other indicators of recent wildlife activity. The blind surroundings showed no evidence of disturbance, and the structure itself appeared to be in excellent condition. A small solar panel provided power for the interior lighting and ventilation system, while a composting toilet facility was located 50 yards away in a screened enclosure. The interior of the observation blind exceeded Sarah's expectations, with professional quality optics, comfortable seating, and reference materials mounted on the walls. Large topographic maps showed the surrounding terrain in detail, while identification charts helped observers distinguish between different bear individuals and classify their behaviors. A logbook contained entries from previous research groups, documenting hundreds of wildlife observations over the blind's 22-year history. Dr. Thompson gathered the group around a large spotting scope positioned at the primary observation window. The scope's powerful magnification provided detailed views of the avalanche chute where they had encountered the grizzly bear less than an hour earlier. The bear was still visible in the clearing, continuing its methodical foraging behavior among the scattered debris and emerging vegetation. From this position, we can observe natural behavior without influencing the animal's activities, Thompson explained as he adjusted the scope's focus. This is the ideal situation for behavioral research. The bear is unaware of our presence and is exhibiting normal feeding patterns in prime habitat. The group spent the next 45 minutes documenting the bear's activities through the spotting scope and individual binoculars. Sarah's field notes grew increasingly detailed as she observed the animal's feeding preferences, movement patterns, and interaction with its environment. The bear demonstrated remarkable intelligence in its foraging strategy, using its claws to probe beneath logs and rocks before committing energy to major excavation efforts. David Kowalski attached his camera to the spotting scope, capturing high-resolution images of the bear's feeding behavior. The telephoto lens allowed him to document fine details of the animal's physical condition and foraging techniques without disturbing its natural activities. These photographs would later become important evidence in understanding the events that followed, providing crucial documentation of the bear's size, condition, and behavioral state. At 12:43 p.m., Dr. Thompson suggested breaking for lunch before conducting the afternoon's planned exercises on track identification and habitat assessment. The group unpacked their trail meals and gathered around the blind's central table, continuing their discussions of bear behavior while enjoying sandwiches, trail mix, and hot soup from thermos bottles. The atmosphere remained enthusiastic and educational, with participants sharing observations and asking technical questions about predator ecology. Maria Vasquez used the lunch break to check in with her department's dispatch center via satellite phone, providing a routine position report and updated timeline for the group's activities. The conversation was brief and routine, with no indication of any concerns from the outside world. She confirmed their planned return time of 4:30 p.m. and verified that emergency evacuation procedures remained unchanged. Dr. Richardson took advantage of the break to review her medical kit and confirm that all emergency supplies were properly organized and accessible. Her emergency medical training had taught her to prepare for various wilderness medicine scenarios, from altitude sickness and hypothermia to traumatic injuries requiring field stabilization and evacuation. The remote location and challenging terrain made advanced preparation essential for any serious medical emergency. As the group finished lunch and prepared for the afternoon's activities, the grizzly bear remained visible in the distant clearing, now focusing its attention on a fallen log that appeared to contain a substantial ant colony. The bear's persistence and methodical approach to foraging continued to provide valuable learning opportunities, with each participant gaining deeper appreciation for the intelligence and adaptability of these remarkable predators. At 1:15 p.m., Dr. Thompson announced that the afternoon session would include hands-on training in track identification and aging, habitat assessment techniques, and emergency response procedures. The group would work in pairs to examine various sites around the observation blind, documenting wildlife sign and practicing field skills that were essential for professional wildlife work. This practical training component was designed to complement the morning's observational learning with active skill development. Sarah partnered with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison for the afternoon exercises, finding his military background provided interesting perspectives on tactical movement and risk assessment in dangerous environments. Their first assignment involved examining a game trail that passed within 50 yards of the observation blind, looking for tracks, scat, hair samples and other sign that could provide insights into local wildlife populations and movement patterns. The game trail showed evidence of use by multiple species, including elk, deer, mountain goats, and several predators. Morrison's tracking skills, developed during military survival training, proved excellent at identifying subtle sign that Sarah might have overlooked. Together, they documented several sets of tracks, including what appeared to be relatively fresh bear prints in a muddy section near a seasonal seep. These tracks are probably 12 to 18 hours old, based on the condition of the edges and the moisture content, Morrison observed, kneeling beside the clearest print. The size and spacing suggest an adult bear, possibly the same individual we observed this morning, though it's difficult to be certain without more detailed measurements. Sarah photographed the tracks using a ruler for scale reference, while Morrison recorded GPS coordinates and estimated timing in their shared field notebook. The track documentation process required careful attention to detail, as subtle differences in size, spacing, and wear patterns could provide crucial information for individual bear identification and population monitoring. Meanwhile, other teams were conducting similar exercises throughout the area around the observation blind. Dr. Richardson and Thomas Brennan were examining claw marks on several large trees, documenting the height, spacing, and apparent age of the markings. These bear trees served multiple functions in grizzly bear social behavior, including scent marking, claw maintenance, and territorial communication. David Kowalski and Dr. O'Brien had discovered an extensive digging site approximately 100 yards from the blind, where a bear had excavated a ground squirrel colony sometime within the previous week. The site showed clear evidence of the powerful digging capabilities that made grizzly bears such effective foragers, with earth and rocks scattered over a wide area. They documented the excavation with photographs and detailed measurements, noting the systematic approach the bear had used to access the underground colony. As the afternoon progressed, the various teams reconvened at the observation blind to share their findings and compile a comprehensive picture of wildlife activity in the area. The accumulated evidence painted a portrait of a healthy and diverse ecosystem with multiple bear individuals using the habitat for feeding, traveling, and territorial communication. Dr. Thompson used this information to discuss broader concepts of habitat management and human-wildlife conflict prevention. At 2:47 p.m., the peaceful afternoon was interrupted by a subtle change in the forest's ambient sound patterns. The usual chorus of bird songs and insect activity diminished noticeably, replaced by an unusual quiet that experienced outdoors people recognize as potentially significant. Dr. Thompson, whose decades of wilderness experience had taught him to pay attention to such environmental cues, immediately became more alert and began scanning the surrounding forest. "Everyone stop what you're doing and listen," Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of concern that immediately focused the group's attention. "The forest has gone quiet, which often indicates the presence of a large predator moving through the area. The group gathered inside the observation blind, using the structure's concealment to observe their surroundings without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Through the one-way windows, they could see the forest stretching in all directions, with multiple game trails and natural corridors that could conceal approaching wildlife. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the timber, creating a patchwork of light and darkness that could easily hide a large animal. Maria Vasquez positioned herself at the rear window of the blind, scanning the trail they had used to reach their current location. Her law enforcement training had taught her to always maintain awareness of escape routes and potential threats from multiple directions. "I'm not seeing any movement on our back trail," she reported quietly. "But the thick timber makes it difficult to see very far in any direction." Dr. Richardson checked her watch and consulted the day's schedule. "We're supposed to begin heading back to the research station in about 30 minutes, she said. "Should we consider leaving early if there's increased bear activity in the area?" Thompson continued scanning with his binoculars, paying particular attention to the natural corridors and feeding areas where bears were most likely to travel. "Let's give it a few more minutes to see if we can identify what caused the change in forest activity. It could be something as simple as a helicopter passing over at high altitude, or it might indicate a bear moving through the area." The group maintained their vigilant watch for another 10 minutes, but the forest remained unusually quiet. No obvious cause for the disturbance became apparent, though the absence of normal wildlife activity suggested that something significant had moved through the area recently. Dr. Thompson made the decision to begin their return journey to the research station, reasoning that an early departure would provide additional safety margin if there was indeed increased bear activity in the vicinity. At 3:02 p.m., the group secured their equipment and prepared to leave observation blind Charlie. Each participant conducted a final gear check, ensuring that bear spray was accessible and emergency beacons were functioning properly. The return route would follow the same trail they had used that morning, covering approximately 2.8 miles of varied terrain back to the research station. Dr. Thompson established the hiking order for the return journey, with himself leading the group and Jennifer Martinez serving as the rear guard. The participants were organized in pairs with predetermined spacing, maintaining visual contact while avoiding bunching up in a manner that might provoke defensive behavior from any bears they might encounter. Emergency signals and communication protocols were reviewed one final time before the group left the safety of the observation blind. The descent from the blind began uneventfully, with the group making good time on the switchback trail leading down from the ridge. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs as they descended through the mixed conifer forest, and the normal sounds of bird activity gradually returned as they moved away from whatever had caused the earlier disturbance. Sarah found herself feeling more relaxed as the familiar rhythm of hiking settled in, and the mysterious forest silence was replaced by normal woodland sounds. At 3:24 p.m., approximately 0.8 miles from the observation blind and 2.0 miles from the research station, the group reached Wolverine Crossing, the same creek crossing where they had paused during their morning hike. Dr. Thompson called a brief halt to allow everyone to refill water bottles and conduct a mid-route assessment of the group's condition and timeline. The crossing provided an excellent vantage point for observing the surrounding forest and identifying any potential wildlife activity. Sarah knelt beside the clear creek water, refilling her water bottles with the cold mountain water while enjoying the peaceful sound of flowing water over smooth stones. The creek bottom showed fresh tracks from various wildlife species, including what appeared to be very recent elk tracks in the sandy soil near the water's edge. The abundance of wildlife sign confirmed that this location served as an important watering area for the local animal population. David Kowalski was photographing the various tracks when he noticed something that made him pause and look more carefully. "Dr. Thompson," he called quietly, "I think you should look at these tracks. They appear to be very fresh bear prints, and they're heading in the same direction we're traveling. Thompson immediately moved to examine the tracks, his experienced eye quickly assessing their age, size, and significance. The prints were indeed very fresh, with sharp edges and no evidence of weathering or erosion that would indicate age. The size and spacing suggested a large adult bear, possibly the same individual they had observed that morning, though the track measurements were slightly different from those they had documented earlier. These tracks are probably less than 2 hours old, Thompson concluded after careful examination. The bear appears to be moving down valley, which means it's traveling in the same general direction as our return route. This changes our tactical situation significantly. Jennifer Martinez moved forward to examine the tracks and contribute her extensive experience with bear behavior analysis. Her assessment confirmed Thompson's conclusions about the track age and the bear's direction of travel. More concerning was her observation that the track spacing indicated the bear was moving at a faster pace than typical foraging behavior would suggest. The stride length here suggests the bear was moving with purpose rather than casual foraging, Martinez observed. Bears typically show shorter, more irregular steps when they're feeding or investigating their environment. This pattern looks more like directed travel, possibly in response to some environmental stimulus. The implications of this discovery were significant for the group's safety planning. If the bear was indeed traveling down valley ahead of them, they might encounter the animal at any point along their return route. The narrow trail and dense forest vegetation limited their options for alternate routes, while the terrain made it difficult to maintain visual contact over long distances. Dr. Thompson gathered the group for an impromptu safety briefing, reviewing their options and establishing protocols for potential bear encounters during their return hike. The group's emergency equipment included multiple canisters of bear spray, emergency whistles, and personal locator beacons that could summon rescue assistance if needed. However, the remote location meant that any emergency response would require significant time to reach their position. Our primary strategy will be to make enough noise to alert any bears to our presence well before we get close enough to surprise them, Thompson explained. We'll travel in a tighter formation than usual, with constant communication between team members. If we encounter a bear, everyone needs to follow the established protocols we practiced during training. No sudden movements, no running unless absolutely necessary, and complete discipline in using deterrent devices. At 3:41 p.m., the group resumed their descent toward the research station, traveling with heightened awareness and increased noise discipline to avoid surprising any wildlife they might encounter. The afternoon shadows were growing longer as the sun tracked across the western sky, creating a complex pattern of light and shadow that could easily conceal a large animal until hikers were quite close. The trail descended gradually through a series of natural terraces created by ancient glacial action, with each level offering slightly different vegetation communities and habitat characteristics. Sarah found herself paying much closer attention to the forest around her, scanning for movement or other indicators of wildlife presence. The knowledge that a large grizzly bear was potentially somewhere ahead of them on the trail added a significant element of tension to what had been a routine return hike. Maria Vasquez, whose law enforcement experience included numerous high-stress situations, noticed that different participants were responding to the increased tension in various ways. Some became more focused and alert, while others showed signs of nervous energy that could potentially lead to poor decision-making in a crisis situation. She made mental notes about group dynamics under stress, information that would prove valuable for future training programs. At 3:56 p.m., approximately 1.4 miles from the research station, the group encountered the Avalanche Chute where they had first observed the grizzly bear that morning. The clearing appeared empty from their position on the trail, but the thick vegetation and scattered debris provided numerous concealment opportunities for a large animal. Dr. Thompson called a halt to carefully survey the area before proceeding across the exposed terrain. This is a high-risk area because it offers limited escape options and reduced visibility, Thompson explained as he scanned the clearing with binoculars. We'll cross quickly but carefully, maintaining tight spacing and constant communication. If we encounter a bear in this terrain, our options will be limited, so prevention is our best strategy. The group successfully navigated the avalanche chute without incident, though the tension level remained high throughout the crossing. On the far side, the trail re-entered the forest canopy, providing better concealment, but also reducing visibility of potential threats. The dense timber and understory vegetation created an environment where bears could easily remain hidden until hikers were quite close. As they continued their descent, Sarah began to feel the accumulated stress of the day's heightened awareness. Her shoulders were tense from constantly scanning the forest, and her grip on her trekking poles had become unnecessarily tight. She made a conscious effort to relax her posture and maintain steady breathing, knowing that excessive tension could impair her reaction time and decision-making ability if a real emergency developed. At 4:07 p.m., the group was approximately 0.9 miles from the research station when David Kowalski, who was hiking in the third position behind Dr. Thompson and Jennifer Martinez, spotted movement in the forest approximately 100 yards ahead and slightly uphill from the trail. He immediately raised his hand for silence and pointed toward the disturbance, his photojournalist experience having taught him to quickly identify and track moving subjects in complex environments. Dr. Thompson stopped the group and raised his binoculars to investigate Kowalski's sighting. Through the dense forest vegetation, he could make out the distinctive brown bulk of a large grizzly bear moving through the timber parallel to their route of travel. The bear appeared to be traveling in the same general direction as the group, though at a different elevation and approximately 100 yards from the trail. "Bear in sight," Thompson whispered to the group, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the still forest air. "Large adult grizzly, appears to be traveling parallel to our route. Everyone slowly move off the trail and group up behind those large trees." The group executed the movement with practiced precision, each participant having drilled these procedures during their training sessions. They positioned themselves behind a cluster of large Douglas fir trees that provided concealment while allowing observation of both the bear and their immediate surroundings. Everyone checked that their bear spray was readily accessible and confirmed their understanding of the group's emergency signals. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see that this was indeed a very large grizzly bear, with the massive shoulder hump and distinctive facial features that marked it as a mature male. The animal appeared to be in excellent physical condition, with a thick, glossy coat and confident movement patterns that suggested a dominant individual comfortable in its territory. Its estimated weight appeared to exceed 600 pounds, making it one of the largest bears any of the participants had ever observed. The bear's behavior initially appeared normal for a traveling animal, steady movement through the forest with occasional pauses to investigate interesting scents or sounds. However, Dr. Thompson noticed subtle signs that suggested the bear might be aware of their presence. Its head position was slightly elevated, with ears rotating forward in an alert posture, and its route seemed to be gradually converging with the trail ahead of their current position. "I think he knows we're here," Thompson whispered to Jennifer Martinez, who was positioned beside him with her own binoculars focused on the bear. "His body language suggests he's monitoring our location while continuing to travel. This could develop into a more serious situation if he decides to investigate us directly." Martinez nodded grimly, her extensive experience with bear encounters confirming Thompson's assessment. "His route is definitely converging with the trail," she whispered back. "If he continues on his current heading, he'll intersect our route somewhere between here and the research station. We need to decide whether to wait here until he passes or try to detour around him. The group's position offered both advantages and disadvantages for dealing with a potentially problematic bear encounter. The large trees provided good concealment and some protection, while their elevated position on the hillside gave them excellent visibility of the bear's movements. However, their current location was approximately 0.9 miles from help, with challenging terrain that would make rapid evacuation difficult if the situation deteriorated. Dr. Thompson made the decision to remain in position and monitor the bear's behavior before determining their next course of action. The animal's current trajectory would take it across the trail somewhere ahead of their position, potentially clearing their route back to the research station. However, if the bear decided to investigate the human scents it had undoubtedly detected, the group could find themselves in a very dangerous situation with limited escape options. For the next 12 minutes, the group maintained their concealed position while observing the grizzly bear's movements through the forest. The animal continued its steady travel, pausing occasionally to investigate fallen logs or test the air for interesting scents. Sarah documented the bear's behavior in her field notebook, noting movement patterns, body language, and environmental interactions that provided insights into the animal's current motivation and stress level. At 4:19 p.m., the bear's behavior began to change in ways that immediately concerned the experienced wildlife professionals in the group. The animal stopped its forward travel and began moving in a more searching pattern, with frequent direction changes and elevated head position that indicated active investigation of something in its environment. Most concerning was the bear's gradual movement toward the trail and the group's general location. "He's definitely interested in something in our area," Thompson whispered urgently. "Everyone check your gear and prepare for possible movement. If he continues toward our position, we're going to need to implement our escape plan." Maria Vasquez quietly reviewed their established escape route, which involved moving uphill through the forest to a secondary trail that connected with their main route approximately half a mile closer to the research station. The alternate route was more difficult and would add time to their return journey, but it offered the advantage of avoiding direct confrontation with a potentially aggressive bear. Dr. Richardson felt her heart rate increase as the implications of their situation became clear. Her medical training had included wilderness emergency scenarios, but the reality of being trapped by a large predator in remote terrain was far more intense than any classroom exercise. She mentally reviewed her emergency medical supplies and procedures, knowing that bear attacks often resulted in severe trauma, requiring immediate field treatment. The grizzly bear continued its investigating behavior, now moving more directly toward the group's position. At approximately 75 yards distance, the bear stopped and stood on its hind legs, a behavior that allowed it to better scan for threats and investigate interesting scents. From this position, the bear's massive size was clearly apparent. Its head reached nearly 8 feet above the ground, and its muscular frame spoke of tremendous physical power. "That's a very large male," Jennifer Martinez whispered, her voice tight with controlled tension. "Probably in the 650 to 700-pound range, which puts him in the top tier of Rocky Mountain grizzlies. If he decides to charge, we'll have very little time to react." Dr. Thompson began implementing the group's contingency plan for an aggressive bear encounter. He quietly assigned specific responsibilities to each participant, ensuring that everyone understood their role in either deterring the bear or executing an organized retreat if the situation continued to deteriorate. The group's collective experience and training were about to be tested in the most serious way possible. At 4:23 p.m., the bear dropped back to all fours and resumed movement toward the group's position, now clearly investigating the source of the human scent that had attracted its attention. The animal's pace remained steady rather than aggressive, but its direct approach eliminated any possibility that this was a coincidental encounter. The bear was actively seeking contact with whatever had left the interesting scent trail in its territory. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized that they were about to face exactly the kind of dangerous wildlife encounter that every outdoor professional hoped to avoid. Her training and experience had prepared her intellectually for this possibility, but the reality of watching a 600-plus-pound predator approach their position was far more intense than any simulation or classroom discussion. The forest around them remained eerily quiet, with the normal sounds of birds and insect activity completely absent. This environmental response to the presence of a large predator was itself an indicator of the seriousness of their situation. The entire ecosystem was responding to the potential for violence that hung in the air like a physical presence. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, whose combat experience had taught him to remain calm under extreme stress, was mentally reviewing the group's defensive options and calculating distances and timing for various scenarios. His military background provided valuable perspective on tactical decision-making under pressure, though he recognized that dealing with a large predator presented unique challenges different from human adversaries. At 4:25 p.m., with the bear now approximately 50 yards from their position and closing steadily, Dr. Thompson made the decision to initiate active deterrence measures before the situation progressed to a more dangerous phase. He removed his bear spray from its holster and confirmed that other group members were similarly prepared for defensive action. "Everyone get ready with bear spray," Thompson whispered urgently. "On my signal, we're going to make ourselves appear as large as possible, make noise, and deploy deterrent spray if he continues to approach. Remember, no sudden movements, no direct eye contact, and no running unless I give the specific order." The next few moments would determine whether the group's training and preparation would prove adequate for dealing with one of North America's most dangerous wildlife encounters. The grizzly bear continued its steady approach, now close enough that individual details of its facial features and physical condition were clearly visible to the increasingly desperate humans hiding behind the Douglas fir trees. Sarah's field notebook would never record what happened next, because at 4:26 p.m. on that clear spring afternoon in the Helena National Forest, the careful academic exercise in wildlife observation became a life-and-death struggle for survival against one of nature's most powerful predators. The morning's educational program was about to transform into a horrific ordeal that would test every aspect of the group's training, courage, and will to live. The grizzly bear stopped approximately 30 yards from the group's position, its massive head swaying from side to side as it processed the complex array of scents that marked the location of 12 humans. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and humans regarded each other across a distance that could be closed by the bear in less than 3 seconds. The animal's dark eyes seemed to evaluate the threat and opportunity represented by the group of wildlife professionals who had inadvertently placed themselves in the most dangerous possible situation. Dr. Thompson raised his bear spray canister and prepared to give the signal for coordinated defensive action, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether anyone in the group survived the encounter. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the forest canopy, creating a scene of terrible beauty that would be forever burned into the memory of anyone who lived through what was about to unfold. At 4:27 p.m., the grizzly bear made its decision and charged. The attack began with shocking suddenness and violence that overwhelmed the group's carefully rehearsed defensive procedures. The bear's initial charge covered the 30-yard distance in approximately 2.8 seconds, moving with the fluid power of a natural athlete designed for exactly this type of explosive movement. Dr. Thompson barely had time to deploy his bear spray before the massive predator crashed through the group's defensive perimeter like a runaway freight train. The bear's first target was Jennifer Martinez, who had been positioned slightly forward of the main group to maintain rear security during their observation. The animal struck her with tremendous force, its 650-pound mass traveling at nearly 30 miles per hour, creating an impact that instantly broke several ribs and drove her to the ground. Her bear spray canister flew from her hand as she was knocked unconscious by the initial collision, leaving her defenseless against the grizzly's follow-up attack. Dr. Thompson's bear spray deployment was partially successful, creating a cloud of capsaicin-based deterrent that caused the bear to pause momentarily and shake its massive head. However, the afternoon breeze carried much of the spray away from the animal's face, reducing its effectiveness and allowing the grizzly to continue its assault on the scattered group. The brief pause gave several participants time to deploy their own spray canisters, creating multiple deterrent clouds that began to affect the bear's breathing and vision. Sarah found herself directly in the path of the bear's charge as it pivoted from its initial attack on Martinez toward the main group of humans. She triggered her bear spray at point-blank range, scoring a direct hit on the animal's face and eyes. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, a sound that combined the bass notes of thunder with the primal scream of an apex predator driven beyond all tolerance. The bear's massive paw swept towards Sarah with the speed of a heavyweight boxer's hook, catching her in the chest and launching her backward into a large boulder. The impact with the rock knocked the breath from Sarah's lungs and sent shooting pains through her left shoulder and ribcage. She rolled desperately to her right as the bear's claws raked the stone where she had been lying, gouging deep scratches in the granite surface. Her bear spray canister had been knocked from her grasp, leaving her with no means of defense except her hiking poles and whatever natural cover she could find. David Kowalski, whose photojournalist instincts had initially led him to reach for his camera, quickly realized the magnitude of their desperate situation and switched to survival mode. He emptied his bear spray canister at the grizzly's face, adding to the deterrent cloud that was beginning to affect the animal's respiratory system. The bear coughed and sneezed violently, spraying saliva and mucus as it struggled to clear its airways, while continuing to attack the humans who had invaded its territory. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's military training proved invaluable as he coordinated defensive actions while moving to assist the injured Jennifer Martinez. He dragged her unconscious form behind a large fallen log while deploying smoke grenades from his emergency kit, creating additional visual barriers and confusion that might disrupt the bear's ability to target individual humans. His combat experience had taught him that survival often depended on creating chaos that worked to the defender's advantage. Dr. Richardson, despite her terror, immediately shifted into medical emergency mode and began triaging the injured while trying to avoid the bear's continued attacks. Martinez was unconscious with obvious chest trauma. Sarah was mobile but clearly hurt, and several other participants showed signs of minor injuries from their desperate attempts to find cover. The grizzly's roars and the screams of injured humans created a cacophony of violence that echoed through the forest. The bear's attacks were not random or mindless. The animal displayed the tactical intelligence that made grizzlies such effective predators. It systematically worked to prevent the humans from grouping together for mutual defense, using its speed and power to keep them scattered and vulnerable. When participants attempted to coordinate their defensive efforts, the bear would charge their position, forcing them to scatter again before they could establish an effective perimeter. Maria Vasquez activated her emergency locator beacon and attempted to reach her department's dispatch center via satellite phone, though the bear's continued proximity made sustained communication extremely difficult. She managed to transmit their GPS coordinates and a brief description of their situation before being forced to abandon the communication attempt and seek cover from another of the bear's charges. Thomas Brennan, the youngest member of the group, found himself separated from the others when the bear's initial charge split their formation. He took refuge behind a cluster of smaller trees, approximately 40 yards from the main action, from where he could observe the ongoing battle without being an immediate target. His position allowed him to document the bear's behavior and the group's defensive responses, information that would later prove crucial for understanding the attack dynamics. The grizzly's assault continued for nearly 8 minutes of sustained violence, during which time the bear seemed to be operating on pure territorial aggression rather than predatory behavior. The animal was not attempting to kill and consume the humans. Instead, it appeared to be teaching them a harsh lesson about respecting the boundaries of its domain. This distinction would later be important for wildlife biologists studying the incident, as it suggested the attack might have been avoided with different human behavior. Dr. O'Brien, the trauma psychologist, found himself experiencing firsthand the kind of extreme stress reactions he had spent years studying in others. His academic knowledge of psychological responses to life-threatening situations proved both helpful and strangely detached as he observed his own fear responses while simultaneously trying to survive the most dangerous situation of his life. He would later describe the experience as profoundly educational from a clinical perspective, though he never wished to repeat the learning experience. At 4:35 p.m., the accumulated effects of multiple bear spray deployments finally began to seriously impact the grizzly's ability to continue its attack. The animal's eyes were streaming tears. Its respiratory system was compromised by the capsaicin irritants, and its general discomfort level had reached the point where continued aggression was becoming more costly than beneficial. The bear began to show signs of wanting to disengage from the conflict and remove itself from the source of its chemical irritation. However, the grizzly's retreat was not immediate or complete. The animal continued to display threatening behavior, making false charges toward any humans who attempted to move from their defensive positions. Its massive size and obvious physical power made it clear that renewed attack could occur at any moment if the bear perceived additional threats or provocations from the scattered group of researchers. Dr. Thompson, whose bear spray canister was now empty, began coordinating the group's emergency response efforts while maintaining constant vigilance for signs of renewed aggression from the grizzly. His decades of experience with dangerous wildlife situations had taught him that the period immediately following an attack was often as dangerous as the attack itself, as injured bears or those suffering from chemical deterrent effects could display unpredictable and extremely violent behavior. Jennifer Martinez regained consciousness to find herself lying behind the fallen log where Morrison had dragged her to safety. Her chest felt as though it had been hit by a sledgehammer, and breathing was extremely painful, suggesting significant internal injuries. Despite her condition, her first concern was for the safety of her colleagues and the need to coordinate their evacuation from the continued threat posed by the grizzly bear. The bear finally began to withdraw from the immediate area at 4:41 p.m., moving slowly uphill through the forest, while continuing to display agitated body language. The animal stopped frequently to look back at the humans, its chemical-irritated eyes streaming tears that mixed with blood from minor scratches it had sustained during the conflict. The grizzly's retreat was grudging and incomplete, suggesting it might return if the humans failed to leave its territory promptly. Sarah struggled to her feet, wincing from the pain in her shoulder and ribs where the bear's massive paw had struck her. Her left arm was difficult to move, and she suspected she had sustained a separated shoulder or possibly broken collarbone from her impact with the boulder. However, her injuries were not immediately life-threatening, allowing her to assist with the group's emergency response efforts. Dr. Richardson conducted a rapid triage assessment of the group's injuries while monitoring the bear's continued presence approximately 100 yards uphill from their position. Martinez had sustained the most serious injuries, with probable broken ribs and possible internal bleeding that would require immediate evacuation to trauma care facilities. Sarah's shoulder injury was painful but stable, while several other participants had sustained minor cuts, bruises, and abrasions during their desperate defensive actions. The group's emergency communication efforts finally achieved success when Maria Vasquez managed to establish contact with her department's dispatch center via satellite phone. Her report of a serious bear attack with multiple injured personnel triggered immediate activation of the Helena National Forest's emergency response protocols, including deployment of helicopter evacuation assets and coordination with local hospital trauma teams. At 4:52 p.m., the group began their desperate evacuation from the attack site, with the injured Jennifer Martinez supported between Dr. Thompson and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. The bear remained visible on the hillside above them, continuing to monitor their movements, while gradually increasing the distance between itself and them and the humans who had invaded its territory. The animal's behavior suggested it was satisfied with the lesson it had delivered, but remained prepared to renew hostilities if necessary. The evacuation route followed the same trail they had been hiking when the attack occurred, leading toward the research station 0.9 miles away through challenging terrain that would test their ability to move injured personnel rapidly and safely. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, and the approaching evening would bring both cooling temperatures and reduced visibility that could complicate rescue operations. Sarah's field notebook, which had been scattered during the attack, lay abandoned among the scattered gear and bear spray canisters that marked the site of their desperate struggle for survival. The academic documentation of bear behavior had been replaced by the harsh reality of human fragility when confronted by one of nature's most powerful predators. The morning's educational program had become an afternoon's fight for life, with outcomes that would affect every participant for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Thompson led the evacuation with constant attention to both the terrain ahead and the grizzly bear still monitoring their movements from the hillside above. His experience with wilderness emergencies had taught him that successful evacuation depended on maintaining steady progress while avoiding additional injuries or complications that could further endanger the group. The bear's continued presence meant that stopping to rest or provide extended medical care could trigger renewed aggressive behavior. The group's movement down the trail was necessarily slow due to Martinez's injuries and the need to maintain security watch for the bear's possible return. Every participant was hyper-alert to sounds and movements in the surrounding forest, knowing that grizzly bears could move through dense timber with surprising stealth when they chose to do so. The psychological trauma of the attack had left everyone in a heightened state of awareness that would persist for days or weeks after their physical injuries healed. At 5:07 p.m., approximately 0.6 miles from the research station, the group encountered the first of the emergency response personnel who'd been dispatched following Vasquez's distress call. 2 Helena National Forest Rangers, equipped with emergency medical supplies and high-powered rifles for bear deterrence, met them on the trail and immediately began providing advanced first aid to the injured participants. Ranger Patricia Ann Callahan, a 28-year-old emergency medical technician with 6 years of wilderness rescue experience, took charge of Jennifer Martinez's medical care, while her partner, Ranger Michael James Rodriguez, established security watch for the bear that was reportedly still in the area. Callahan's assessment confirmed significant chest trauma requiring immediate helicopter evacuation to trauma care facilities in Helena. "We've got a medical helicopter inbound to the research station landing zone," Callahan reported as she stabilized Martinez's injuries with chest wrapping and pain medication. ETA is approximately 12 minutes, and they'll have a full trauma team standing by at Providence St. Peter Hospital. We need to get her there as quickly as possible to rule out internal bleeding and other complications. The evacuation continued with increased urgency as the medical emergency took precedence over other considerations. The bear had not been observed for nearly 20 minutes, suggesting it had withdrawn deeper into the forest, though rangers maintained security protocols designed to prevent additional encounters. The group's survival of the initial attack was now dependent on rapidly delivering advanced medical care to the most seriously injured participant. Sarah's shoulder injury was treated with immobilization and pain medication, allowing her to continue hiking under her own power with assistance from other participants. Her academic interest in bear behavior had been replaced by intimate personal knowledge of just how quickly a routine research expedition could transform into a life-threatening emergency. The experience would fundamentally change her approach to fieldwork and risk management for the remainder of her career. At 5:23 p.m., the group reached the research station's helicopter landing zone, where emergency medical personnel were preparing to receive the most critically injured attack victim. The Lifeline helicopter from Helena's Emergency Medical Services was already approaching from the southeast, its rotor noise echoing off the surrounding mountains as it prepared to land in the clearing adjacent to the research station's main lodge. The helicopter crew included flight paramedic Sandra Michelle Watson, a 15-year veteran of emergency medical services whose experience with trauma cases made her invaluable in situations like this. Her partner, flight nurse Robert David Chen, specialized in wilderness medicine and had treated numerous victims of wildlife attacks during his 8-year career with the helicopter program. Their aircraft was equipped with advanced life support capabilities and direct communication links to the trauma surgery team at Providence St. Peter Hospital. Jennifer Martinez was loaded onto the helicopter at 5:31 p.m. with her vital signs stable but concerning given the mechanism of her injuries. The bear's impact had caused significant blunt force trauma to her chest and abdomen, with potential complications that would require immediate surgical evaluation. The helicopter departed for Helena at 5:34 p.m., beginning the 30-minute flight that would deliver her to definitive medical care. The remaining participants were transported to the research station's main lodge, where additional medical personnel conducted detailed examinations and provided treatment for their various injuries. Sarah's shoulder injury was confirmed as a separated acromioclavicular joint that would require orthopedic follow-up, but was not immediately life-threatening. Several other participants had sustained minor injuries during their desperate defensive actions, but none required emergency evacuation. Dr. Richardson, despite her own minor injuries, immediately began providing psychological first aid to participants who were showing signs of acute stress reaction from their traumatic experience. Her medical training included trauma psychology, and she recognized the importance of early intervention in preventing long-term psychological complications from the attack. The group's collective response to the crisis had been remarkably effective, but the emotional aftermath would require careful management. As word of the attack spread through the emergency response community, additional personnel began arriving at the research station to assist with the investigation and ongoing security concerns. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Conservation Officers, Helena National Forest law enforcement rangers, and personnel from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Grizzly Bear Management Program all responded to coordinate the official investigation and determine appropriate follow-up actions. The attack site was secured by armed rangers who would maintain security while wildlife specialists examined the scene for evidence that might explain the bear's aggressive behavior. Initial reports suggested the attack was consistent with territorial defense rather than predatory behavior, but detailed investigation would be required to determine whether the bear posed an ongoing threat to public safety that might require lethal removal. Dr. Thompson, despite his own minor injuries and emotional trauma from the attack, began providing preliminary reports to the investigating agencies. His decades of experience with bear behavior made his observations crucial for understanding the incident and developing appropriate management responses. The attack represented a serious escalation in human-bear conflict for the Helena National Forest area, where such aggressive encounters were relatively rare. At 6:15 p.m., the research station received confirmation that Jennifer Martinez had arrived at Providence St. Peter Hospital and was undergoing emergency surgery to address internal injuries sustained during the bear attack. Initial surgical findings indicated severe bruising to internal organs, but no immediately life-threatening damage, though her recovery would require extended hospitalization and rehabilitation. The successful medical evacuation had likely saved her life and prevented permanent disability from her injuries. The psychological impact of the attack was already becoming apparent among the surviving participants, with various individuals displaying classic symptoms of acute stress reaction, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and physical symptoms of anxiety. Dr. O'Brien, despite being a victim himself, began providing informal counseling to his fellow participants while recognizing that professional psychological support would be necessary for the entire group. Media representatives began arriving at the research station by 6:45 p.m., drawn by scanner reports of a serious bear attack with multiple injuries. The story quickly gained national attention as one of the most significant grizzly bear attacks in Montana's recent history, with particular interest focusing on the fact that the victims were experienced wildlife professionals rather than inexperienced recreational users. The incident raised important questions about bear management, human behavior in bear habitat, and the effectiveness of current safety protocols. Dr. Marcus Thompson found himself serving as the primary spokesperson for the group, providing carefully worded statements to media representatives while protecting the privacy of injured participants and avoiding speculation about the bear's motivation or the circumstances that led to the attack. His experience with controversial wildlife issues had taught him the importance of accurate, measured communication during crisis situations. The investigation of the attack site revealed extensive physical evidence of the violent encounter, including damaged vegetation, scattered equipment, and chemical residue from multiple bear spray deployments. Wildlife specialists were able to collect hair and saliva samples from the attacking bear, which would be analyzed for DNA identification and health status. The physical evidence supported witness accounts of a sustained attack by a single large male grizzly bear. As night fell over the Helena National Forest, armed rangers maintained security patrols around the research station, while wildlife specialists used thermal imaging equipment to monitor for the presence of the attacking bear. The animal had not been observed since the attack ended, but grizzly bears were known for their ability to remain undetected in forest environments when they chose to avoid human contact. The bear's current location and intentions remained unknown, creating ongoing safety concerns for the area. The first detailed medical report from Providence St. Peter Hospital arrived at 8:22 p.m., confirming that Jennifer Martinez had survived emergency surgery to repair internal injuries caused by the bear attack. Her condition was listed as serious but stable, with expectations for full recovery given appropriate rehabilitation and follow-up care. The news provided tremendous relief to her colleagues who had fought desperately to save her life during the chaotic evacuation from the attack site. Sarah's shoulder injury was treated at the research station's medical facility with immobilization and pain management, though she would require orthopedic evaluation and possibly surgery once she returned to Colorado. The separation of her acromioclavicular joint was a significant injury that would require months of rehabilitation, but it would not permanently impair her ability to continue her career in wildlife research. Her close encounter with the grizzly bear had provided educational experiences she could never have gained from textbooks or classroom instruction. The group's equipment recovery efforts revealed the extent of the violence that had occurred during the 8-minute attack. Bear spray canisters were scattered throughout the area, some completely empty, while others had been damaged by the bear's claws or the participants' desperate defensive actions. Field notebooks, cameras and scientific equipment bore the marks of the struggle, with some items damaged beyond repair and others missing entirely. Dr. Thompson's preliminary incident report, completed at 9:45 p.m., documented the timeline and circumstances of the attack in the clinical language required for official investigations. However, the dry, factual narrative could not convey the terror, courage, and determination displayed by 12 wildlife professionals who had faced one of nature's most dangerous predators and lived to tell their story. The report would become the foundation for extensive analysis by wildlife managers, researchers, and safety specialists. The psychological aftermath of the attack was already becoming apparent as participants processed their experience and began to understand how close they had come to death or permanent disability. Several individuals reported difficulty sleeping, recurring thoughts about the attack, and heightened startle responses to unexpected sounds or movements. Dr. O'Brien recognized these as normal responses to extreme trauma, though he knew that professional counseling would be necessary for some participants. Media coverage of the attack dominated regional news broadcasts throughout the evening, with particular focus on the rarity of such aggressive encounters and the experience level of the victims. The incident sparked renewed debate about grizzly bear management policies, human behavior in bear habitat, and the adequacy of current safety protocols for researchers and recreational users. Wildlife advocacy groups and hunting organizations quickly polarized around different interpretations of the attack's significance. At 10:30 p.m., the research station received an updated medical report indicating that Jennifer Martinez was conscious and communicating with medical personnel, though she remained in intensive care for monitoring of potential complications. Her survival and expected recovery represented the successful outcome of training, teamwork, and emergency medical response that had prevented a tragedy from becoming a fatality. The bear attack had been survived, but its impacts would continue for months or years to come. The night passed quietly at the research station, with participants struggling to sleep despite their exhaustion from the day's traumatic events. Armed rangers maintained security patrols, while wildlife specialists monitored for signs of the attacking bear, though the animal appeared to have withdrawn deeper into the forest. The immediate crisis had passed, but the investigation, recovery, and analysis of the attack would continue for weeks as agencies worked to understand the incident and develop appropriate management responses. The following morning brought a parade of investigators, media representatives, and support personnel to the research station as the attack became the focus of intense scrutiny from multiple agencies and organizations. The participants found themselves reliving their traumatic experience through detailed interviews and witness statements, a process that was necessary for the official investigation but difficult for people still processing their emotional responses to the attack. Sarah's evacuation to Denver for orthopedic treatment was delayed until investigators could complete her witness statement, during which she provided detailed observations of the bear's behavior and the group's defensive responses. Her academic background in wildlife biology made her testimony particularly valuable for understanding the animal's motivations and the effectiveness of various deterrent strategies. The attack had transformed her from an objective researcher into a primary source of data about human-bear conflict. Dr. Thompson's leadership during the crisis had undoubtedly saved lives and prevented more serious injuries, though he found it difficult to discuss his role without thinking about decisions that might have prevented the attack entirely. His decades of experience with dangerous wildlife had prepared him well for managing the emergency, but the psychological burden of responsibility weighed heavily on him as he analyzed every aspect of the group's preparation and response. The bear responsible for the attack was never located, despite extensive search efforts by wildlife specialists using helicopters, tracking dogs, and thermal imaging equipment. DNA analysis of hair and saliva samples confirmed it was an adult male grizzly bear in good health, with no indication of disease or injury that might have contributed to aggressive behavior. The animal's motivation appeared to be territorial defense rather than predatory behavior, suggesting the attack could have been avoided with different human behavior or timing. Investigation of the attack site revealed that the group had unknowingly positioned themselves in a natural travel corridor regularly used by bears moving between feeding areas and bedding sites. Recent weather patterns had concentrated bear activity in the specific area where the attack occurred, creating conditions for conflict that were not apparent to even experienced wildlife professionals. The incident highlighted the challenges of predicting and preventing bear encounters in dynamic wilderness environments. The research station's safety protocols were extensively reviewed and updated based on lessons learned from the attack, with particular emphasis on group communication, emergency equipment standardization, and evacuation procedures for injured personnel. The incident had demonstrated both the value of preparation and training and the limitations of any safety system when dealing with large predators in their natural habitat. Future research programs would incorporate additional safety measures based on the hard-won experience of the attack survivors. Media coverage of the attack continued for several weeks, focusing on questions about bear management policies, wilderness safety practices, and the broader implications for human-wildlife coexistence in recovering grizzly bear populations. The incident became a case study in wildlife management programs and emergency response training across North America, providing valuable lessons for professionals who work in dangerous wildlife habitats. Jennifer Martinez's recovery progressed well through her extended hospitalization, though she would require several months of rehabilitation to fully recover from her injuries. Her experience as the most severely injured victim of the attack made her a reluctant expert on bear attack survival, with numerous requests for interviews and presentations about her experience. She found the attention difficult to manage while focusing on her physical and psychological recovery from the trauma. The psychological support provided to attack survivors proved crucial for their long-term recovery, with several participants requiring extended counseling to address post-traumatic stress symptoms that developed in the weeks following their experience. Dr. O'Brien's dual role as both victim and psychological specialist provided unique insights into trauma recovery that would benefit future wilderness attack survivors. The emotional recovery from the attack would prove longer and more complex than the physical healing process. Sarah returned to her doctoral research with a fundamentally changed perspective on human-wildlife interactions and the risks inherent in fieldwork. Her separated shoulder healed well with appropriate orthopedic treatment and rehabilitation, leaving her with full function but permanent reminders of her close encounter with a grizzly bear. The attack had provided her with first-hand experience of bear behavior under extreme circumstances, knowledge that would make her a more effective researcher and educator throughout her career. The Helena National Forest continued operating the Blackwater Canyon Research Station, though safety protocols were significantly enhanced and group sizes were reduced for programs involving travel in prime grizzly bear habitat. The attack had demonstrated that even experienced professionals could find themselves in extremely dangerous situations, reinforcing the need for constant vigilance and preparation when working in predator habitat. The facility's reputation for excellence in wildlife education remained intact, enhanced by hard-won experience in emergency response and risk management. The grizzly bear responsible for the attack was never captured or identified among the local bear population, suggesting it either died naturally or moved to a different area following the incident. Wildlife managers concluded that the attack represented defensive territorial behavior rather than predatory aggression, indicating that the bear was unlikely to seek additional human contact unless confronted with similar circumstances. No additional attacks occurred in the area, though bear activity remained high throughout the following years. The incident report generated by the investigating agencies became required reading for wildlife professionals, emergency responders, and wilderness safety instructors throughout North America. The detailed documentation of the attack sequence, defensive responses, and evacuation procedures provided valuable lessons for preventing and surviving similar encounters. The report's conclusions emphasized the importance of preparation, training, and teamwork in surviving dangerous wildlife encounters, while acknowledging that some risks cannot be completely eliminated in wilderness environments. Dr. Thompson continued his career in wildlife research and education, though the attack had a profound impact on his approach to fieldwork and safety management. His experience in leading the group's survival and evacuation efforts made him a sought-after instructor for wilderness safety programs, where he shared hard-won lessons about leadership under extreme stress. The attack had tested every aspect of his knowledge and experience, proving the value of decades of preparation while highlighting the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters. The research program that had brought the group together was eventually resumed with enhanced safety protocols and modified objectives based on lessons learned from the attack. The incident had demonstrated the value of hands-on learning in wildlife management education, though it had also shown that such education came with inherent risks that required careful management and preparation. Future programs would benefit from the experience and knowledge gained through the survivor's ordeal. The media attention surrounding the attack gradually faded as other news stories captured public interest, but the incident remained a significant case study in wildlife management and wilderness safety education. The survivors' experiences continued to provide valuable insights for researchers, managers, and educators working to reduce human-wildlife conflict while preserving opportunities for people to experience and study wildlife in natural settings. The attack had become part of the historical record of human grizzly bear interactions, contributing to the body of knowledge that guides wildlife management decisions and safety practices. Years later, the survivors of the Blackwater Canyon bear attack would gather annually to commemorate their shared experience and maintain the bonds forged during their desperate fight for survival. Their story served as a powerful reminder of both human vulnerability and resilience when confronted by the raw power of nature's greatest predators. The attack had changed their lives forever, providing them with knowledge, perspective, and appreciation for life that could only come from facing mortality and surviving through courage, preparation, and teamwork. The legacy of the attack extended beyond the immediate participants to influence wilderness safety practices, wildlife management policies, and research methodologies throughout North America. The lessons learned from their experience would help prevent future attacks and improve survival rates for those who might face similar encounters. The Blackwater Canyon mauling had become more than a traumatic incident. It had become a source of knowledge that would protect future generations of wildlife professionals and wilderness users who ventured into the domain of the grizzly bear. The impact of the Blackwater Canyon attack reverberated through the wildlife research community for months after the incident, fundamentally changing how institutions approached fieldwork safety in grizzly bear habitat. Dr. Sarah Hendricks found herself at the center of this transformation as she recovered from her shoulder injury and processed the psychological trauma of her near-death experience. Her separated acromioclavicular joint required 3 months of intensive physical therapy, during which time she had ample opportunity to reflect on how the attack had changed her perspective on human-wildlife interactions and research methodologies. The orthopedic surgeon who treated Sarah's shoulder injury, Dr. Patricia Ann Morrison, had extensive experience with wilderness-related trauma from her practice in Denver, where she regularly treated climbers, skiers, and outdoor recreationists who had sustained injuries in Colorado's backcountry. However, she had never before treated a researcher injured in a grizzly bear attack, and she found Sarah's case both medically interesting and personally compelling. The separation of the acromioclavicular joint, caused by the massive impact of the bear's paw against Sarah's chest, required surgical repair with titanium hardware to restore full function to the joint. "The mechanism of injury in your case is quite unusual, Doctor," Morrison explained during one of Sarah's follow-up appointments 6 weeks after the attack. "The force required to cause this type of separation suggests an impact equivalent to a high-speed motor vehicle accident. The fact that you survived the initial contact with the bear and were able to continue defensive actions speaks to both your physical conditioning and remarkable presence of mind under extreme stress." Sarah's physical therapy sessions with certified athletic trainer Michael James Kowalski became opportunities to process not only her physical recovery, but also the psychological aspects of her survival experience. Kowalski, who had worked with numerous trauma patients during his 15-year career, recognized the complex interplay between physical healing and emotional recovery that characterized survivors of life-threatening encounters. His approach emphasized rebuilding not only physical strength and mobility, but also confidence and trust in her body's ability to function effectively in challenging situations. Recovery from this type of trauma involves more than just restoring range of motion and strength, Kowalski explained as Sarah worked through shoulder rehabilitation exercises. "You're also rebuilding confidence in your physical capabilities and addressing the hypervigilance and startle responses that are common after survival experiences. The goal is to return you to full function, both physically and psychologically, so you can continue your research career without being limited by fear or physical limitations." The psychological support provided to Sarah and the other attack survivors was coordinated by Dr. Amanda K. Richardson, who had transitioned from her role as a participant in the attack to serving as a psychological consultant for the group's recovery. Her dual background in veterinary medicine and trauma psychology, combined with her first-hand experience of the attack, made her uniquely qualified to understand the complex emotional responses that emerged in the weeks and months following their survival experience. "What you're experiencing is completely normal for survivors of life-threatening encounters," Dr. Richardson explained during one of Sarah's counseling sessions 8 weeks after the attack. "The hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts about the attack, and heightened startle responses are your brain's way of trying to protect you from similar threats in the future. However, these responses can become problematic if they interfere with your daily life or prevent you from pursuing activities that are important to you." Sarah's graduate advisor at Colorado State University, Dr. Jennifer Lynn Martinez, had been following her recovery closely while dealing with her own rehabilitation from the severe chest injuries she had sustained as the bear's primary target during the attack. Martinez's injuries had been life-threatening, requiring emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding and address multiple rib fractures that had punctured her lung tissue. Her recovery was complicated by the development of pneumonia 3 weeks after the surgery, extending her hospitalization and rehabilitation timeline significantly. The most challenging aspect of my recovery hasn't been the physical injuries, Martinez explained during a video conference call with Sarah from her hospital room in Helena. It's been dealing with the psychological impact of being so completely helpless during the attack. As someone who has spent 15 years managing bear encounters and teaching others how to survive in bear country, being knocked unconscious in the first seconds of the attack and having no memory of the defensive actions that saved my life has been profoundly disturbing. The investigation of the Blackwater Canyon attack was led by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Bear Management Specialist Dr. Robert David Chen, whose 22-year career had included investigation of over 40 bear attacks throughout Montana, Alaska, and Alberta. Chen's analysis of the incident focused on identifying the environmental and behavioral factors that had led to the unusually aggressive encounter, with particular attention to lessons that could be applied to preventing future attacks. This attack represents a convergence of multiple factors that created an extremely dangerous situation for even experienced wildlife professionals, Chen explained in his preliminary report issued 6 weeks after the incident. The bear was a large, dominant male in prime physical condition, operating in familiar territory during the peak period of spring foraging activity. The research group, despite their extensive experience and proper safety protocols, found themselves in a natural travel corridor during a period of concentrated bear activity that they could not have predicted based on available information. Chen's investigation revealed that the attacking bear was likely the same individual that had been documented by motion-activated cameras throughout the Blackwater Canyon area for the previous 3 years. Trail camera photographs showed a large male grizzly with distinctive scarring on his right shoulder, matching witness descriptions from the attack. The bear's estimated age was between 12 and 15 years, placing him in the prime of his physical and territorial dominance phase, when male grizzlies are most likely to display aggressive behavior toward perceived threats. Bear 247, as we've designated him in our tracking system, represents exactly the type of individual most likely to be involved in defensive attacks against humans, Chen continued. Large, mature males in prime territory during spring emergence are operating at peak testosterone levels and maximum territorial sensitivity. They have the size, strength, and confidence to confront any perceived threat to their dominance, and they possess the experience to be extremely effective in physical confrontations. The bear's behavior during the attack was consistent with territorial defense rather than predatory aggression, a distinction that had important implications for understanding the animal's motivation and the potential for preventing similar encounters. Territorial defense attacks are typically shorter in duration and less likely to result in fatalities, as the bear's primary objective is to neutralize perceived threats rather than to kill and consume prey animals. However, the physical capabilities of a 650-pound grizzly bear meant that even defensive attacks could easily result in severe injuries or death for human victims. Dr. Marcus Robert Thompson's leadership during the crisis had been instrumental in the group's survival, though he continued to struggle with questions about decisions that might have prevented the attack entirely. His preliminary report, completed 2 months after the incident, provided a detailed timeline of events and analysis of the group's response, but it also revealed his ongoing psychological processing of the traumatic experience. Leadership in crisis situations requires making rapid decisions based on incomplete information while managing both immediate threats and long-term consequences. Thompson wrote in his analysis. In retrospect, there were several decision points where different choices might have prevented the attack, though those alternatives were not apparent given the information available at the time. The challenge for future research programs is to incorporate lessons learned from this incident without becoming so risk-averse that valuable educational opportunities are lost. Thompson's analysis identified several key factors that had contributed to the group's survival and successful evacuation of the most seriously injured victim. The group's extensive safety training, redundant emergency equipment, and practiced communication protocols had enabled them to mount an effective defense against the bear and coordinate a rapid evacuation despite the chaos and trauma of the attack. The presence of multiple participants with emergency medical training had been crucial for providing field treatment that stabilized Jennifer Martinez until professional medical care became available. The emergency response to the attack had demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of wilderness rescue capabilities in remote areas of the Helena National Forest. The initial response by Helena National Forest Rangers had been rapid and professional, with the first rescue personnel reaching the group within 45 minutes of the emergency call. However, the complexity of coordinating helicopter evacuation, medical treatment, and ongoing security concerns had revealed areas where emergency response protocols could be improved. Lifeline helicopter pilot Captain Sandra Michelle Watson had accumulated over 2,800 hours of flight time in emergency medical services, including numerous wilderness rescues in challenging terrain and weather conditions. Her experience with wilderness medical emergencies had prepared her well for the complex logistical challenges of evacuating an injured bear attack victim from a remote location while coordinating with ground personnel managing ongoing security concerns. The medical evacuation from Blackwater Canyon represented every challenging aspect of wilderness emergency response, Watson explained in her after-action report. We had a critically injured patient requiring immediate trauma care, a remote location with limited landing options, potential weather complications, and ongoing security threats from a large predator that remained in the area. The successful outcome was the result of excellent coordination between multiple agencies and the patient's remarkable resilience and will to survive. The helicopter evacuation had required careful coordination with wildlife management personnel to ensure that the aircraft's approach and landing did not trigger renewed aggressive behavior from the bear, which had been observed in the area as recently as 30 minutes before the helicopter's arrival. Armed rangers had maintained security around the landing zone, while wildlife specialists monitored for bear activity using thermal imaging equipment and radio communication with observation posts on surrounding ridges. Flight paramedic Robert Chen's assessment and treatment of Jennifer Martinez during the helicopter flight to Helena had been complicated by the need to monitor for delayed complications from blunt force trauma while managing pain and anxiety in a conscious patient who was fully aware of the severity of her situation. His experience with wilderness trauma cases had taught him that bear attack victims often developed secondary complications hours or days after the initial injury, requiring constant vigilance during the critical transport period. Jennifer's vital signs remained stable throughout the flight, but her mechanism of injury indicated high potential for internal bleeding or other complications that might not become apparent until we reached the hospital, Chen explained in his medical report. The key was providing supportive care while monitoring for signs of deterioration and ensuring that the trauma surgery team at Providence St. Peter Hospital was fully prepared for a complex case that might require immediate surgical intervention. The trauma surgery team at Providence St. Peter Hospital, led by Dr. Kevin Patrick O'Brien, had been alerted to expect a bear attack victim with severe chest trauma approximately 20 minutes before the helicopter's arrival. The team's preparation included reviewing bear attack protocols, confirming availability of blood products and surgical specialists, and preparing the trauma bay for a complex case that might require multiple surgical procedures and extended intensive care support. Bear attacks present unique challenges from a trauma surgery perspective, Dr. O'Brien explained during his presentation at the annual Montana Trauma Conference 6 months after treating Jennifer Martinez. The mechanism of injury typically involves massive blunt force trauma combined with puncture wounds and lacerations from claws and teeth. Patients may present with multiple organ system involvement, complex fracture patterns, and psychological trauma that complicates their surgical and recovery course. Jennifer's surgical procedure had required nearly 4 hours of surgery to repair internal bleeding from a lacerated liver, reconstruct damaged rib structures, and address a punctured lung that had caused significant breathing difficulties. The surgical team's experience with high-energy trauma cases had prepared them well for the complex injury patterns, though the emotional impact of treating a victim of such a violent wildlife encounter had affected everyone involved in her care. The most striking aspect of Jennifer's case was her remarkable mental strength and determination to recover, Dr. O'Brien continued. Despite the severity of her injuries and the traumatic nature of her experience, she maintained a positive attitude and actively participated in her recovery from the first day after surgery. Her background as a park ranger and her experience with wilderness emergencies gave her a realistic understanding of her injuries and recovery timeline that was extremely helpful for her medical team. Jennifer's recovery had been complicated by the development of post-surgical pneumonia that extended her hospitalization to 6 weeks and required intensive respiratory therapy to restore full lung function. The infection, while not uncommon in patients with chest trauma, had been particularly challenging given her specific injury pattern and the psychological stress associated with her survival experience. Her recovery had required the coordinated efforts of respiratory therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and psychological support specialists. Respiratory therapist Maria Elena Vasquez, who had worked with Jennifer throughout her hospital stay, had extensive experience helping trauma patients regain full breathing capacity after chest injuries. Her approach combined traditional respiratory therapy techniques with psychological support designed to address the anxiety and fear that often complicated recovery from traumatic injuries. Jennifer's case had been particularly challenging because her unconsciousness during the attack had created gaps in her memory that generated significant anxiety about the details of her survival. Jennifer's physical recovery proceeded well once we addressed the pneumonia, but her psychological processing of the attack was complicated by her lack of memory about the defensive actions that saved her life, Vasquez explained. She struggled with feelings of helplessness and survivor guilt, despite the fact that her survival was a testament to both her colleagues' heroic efforts and her own remarkable physical and mental resilience. The physical therapy component of Jennifer's recovery had been supervised by Dr. Thomas James Brennan, whose specialization in post-trauma rehabilitation had made him familiar with the complex challenges faced by survivors of violent encounters. His approach emphasized rebuilding not only physical strength and mobility, but also confidence and trust in the body's ability to function effectively in challenging situations. Jennifer's background as a park ranger had provided a strong foundation for her rehabilitation, as her career had required exceptional physical conditioning and mental toughness. Recovery from this type of trauma requires addressing both the physical injuries and the psychological impact of surviving such a violent encounter, Dr. Brennan explained. Jennifer's case was complicated by the fact that she had built her career around managing exactly the type of situation that had nearly killed her. Rebuilding her confidence in her ability to work safely in bear habitat required addressing both her physical capabilities and her trust in the safety protocols that had ultimately saved her life. The investigation into the bear's specific behavior and motivation had been conducted by a team of wildlife biologists led by Dr. Amanda Richardson, whose dual background in veterinary medicine and behavioral ecology made her uniquely qualified to analyze the complex factors that had triggered the attack. Her analysis focused on environmental conditions, bear population dynamics, and human behavior patterns that might have contributed to the unprecedented level of aggression displayed by the attacking animal. The behavioral analysis reveals a complex interaction between territorial behavior, seasonal stress factors, and human intrusion into prime habitat during a critical time period, Dr. Richardson explained in her report issued 4 months after the attack. The bear's response was consistent with defensive territorial behavior rather than predatory aggression, but the intensity and duration of the attack exceeded typical patterns for this type of encounter. This suggests either unusually high stress levels in the bear or some factor that elevated the perceived threat level beyond normal parameters. The analysis of hair and saliva samples collected from the attack site had revealed that the bear was in excellent health, with no indication of disease, injury, or nutritional stress that might have contributed to abnormal behavior. Blood chemistry analysis indicated normal hormone levels consistent with a healthy adult male during spring emergence, ruling out endocrine disorders or other physiological factors that might have influenced the animal's behavior. The bear appeared to be a normal, healthy grizzly operating within expected behavioral parameters for its age, size, and territorial status. Dr. Richardson's behavioral analysis had also examined the group's activities and movement patterns to identify factors that might have been interpreted as threatening by a territorial bear. The research team had followed established protocols for travel and observation in bear habitat, maintaining appropriate noise levels, proper food storage, and defensive equipment readiness. However, their extended observation session at the blind and their route selection had placed them in direct conflict with the bear's preferred travel corridor during peak activity hours. The convergence of multiple factors created a perfect storm scenario that would have been difficult to predict or prevent even with optimal planning and preparation, Richardson concluded. The bear was operating in familiar territory during peak territorial sensitivity, while the research group was conducting legitimate educational activities using established safety protocols. The attack appears to have been triggered by the bear's interpretation of the group's presence as a territorial challenge rather than by any specific mistakes or safety violations. The media coverage of the Blackwater Canyon attack had evolved from initial sensational reporting to more thoughtful analysis of the broader implications for wildlife management and human-bear coexistence. Environmental journalist David Michael Kowalski, who had been a participant in the attack, found himself uniquely positioned to provide insider perspective on both the incident itself and the recovery process experienced by the survivors. His series of articles for Outside Magazine had provided detailed insight into the human aspects of surviving a predator attack while avoiding sensationalism or exploitation of the victim's experiences. The most important aspect of our story is not the violence of the attack itself, but the demonstration of how preparation, training, and teamwork can enable people to survive encounters that might otherwise be fatal, Kowalski wrote in his comprehensive analysis published 6 months after the incident. Every member of our group contributed to our collective survival through actions taken before, during, and after the attack. The incident proves that while we cannot eliminate all risks associated with working in predator habitat, we can significantly improve survival rates through proper preparation and response. Kowalski's photography from the research expedition had provided valuable documentation of the group's activities and the environmental conditions leading up to the attack, though his cameras had been damaged during the violent encounter and had not captured the attack itself. His pre-attack photographs showing the bear engaged in normal foraging behavior had become important evidence in the behavioral analysis, demonstrating that the animal had appeared completely normal until the moment it decided to investigate the human presence in its territory. The psychological impact assessment, conducted by trauma specialist Dr. Kevin O'Brien, had revealed interesting patterns in how different participants had processed their survival experience. His study, conducted with the informed consent of all survivors, had documented various coping mechanisms, stress responses, and recovery trajectories that provided valuable insights for treating future wildlife attack survivors. The research had been approved by multiple institutional review boards and had contributed to improved understanding of post-traumatic stress responses in wilderness survival situations. Each participant's psychological response to the attack was influenced by their previous experience with dangerous situations, their role during the incident, and their individual personality characteristics. Dr. O'Brien explained in his preliminary findings presented at the International Conference on Wilderness Medicine. Interestingly, previous military combat experience, emergency medical training, and law enforcement backgrounds appeared to provide some protection against long-term psychological complications, though all participants experienced some degree of acute stress response immediately following the attack. The study had revealed that participants who had played active roles in the group's defense and evacuation efforts had generally experienced better psychological outcomes than those who had been forced into more passive roles during the crisis. This finding supported established trauma psychology theories about the importance of perceived control and agency in determining psychological responses to life-threatening situations. However, all participants had benefited from group counseling sessions that allowed them to process their shared experience and maintain the social connections forged during their survival ordeal. Lieutenant Colonel James Edward Morrison's military background had provided him with valuable perspectives on leadership under extreme stress and crisis management in life-threatening situations. His after-action analysis of the group's response had identified both strengths and areas for improvement that could benefit future wilderness safety training programs. His experience with combat stress and small unit tactics had made him a valuable resource for understanding the human performance aspects of surviving violent encounters. The parallels between combat survival and wildlife attack survival are striking, Morrison explained in his presentation to military survival instructors. In both situations, success depends on rapid decision-making under extreme stress, effective communication within the team, and maintaining tactical discipline while managing fear and adrenaline responses. The key difference is that wildlife encounters require understanding animal behavior patterns rather than human tactical thinking, but the fundamental principles of survival under stress remain constant. Morrison's analysis had emphasized the importance of pre-planned response protocols and regular training exercises that prepared individuals to function effectively when their normal cognitive processes were disrupted by extreme stress. His recommendations for military survival training had incorporated lessons learned from the bear attack, particularly regarding the value of redundant communication systems and distributed leadership responsibilities that could continue functioning even when key personnel were incapacitated. The impact of the attack on bear management policies throughout Montana and the broader Rocky Mountain region had been significant, though wildlife managers had been careful to avoid overreaction that might compromise broader conservation objectives. The incident had sparked renewed debate about bear population levels, habitat management strategies, and the balance between public safety and wildlife conservation in areas where grizzly bear populations were recovering from historical lows. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Director Dr. Patricia Ann Callahan had convened a special commission to review current bear management protocols and develop recommendations for reducing human-bear conflict while maintaining support for grizzly bear conservation programs. The commission's membership included wildlife biologists, law enforcement officers, representatives from tourism and outdoor recreation industries, and advocacy groups representing both conservation and hunting interests. The Blackwater Canyon attack represents a rare but significant incident that requires careful analysis without allowing emotional responses to override scientific management principles, Director Callahan explained during the Commission's first public hearing. Our objective is to identify specific lessons that can be applied to improving public safety, while maintaining our commitment to grizzly bear recovery and the broader ecosystem conservation goals that depend on healthy predator populations. The Commission's preliminary recommendations had focused on enhanced safety education for research programs and outdoor recreation activities, improved emergency response capabilities in remote areas, and refinements to bear monitoring and tracking systems that could provide better real-time information about bear activity patterns. However, the Commission had rejected calls for more aggressive bear removal policies or restrictions on research activities in bear habitat, concluding that such measures would be counterproductive for both public safety and conservation objectives. The development of improved safety protocols for research programs had become a collaborative effort involving multiple universities, federal agencies, and private organizations involved in wildlife research and education. The enhanced protocols incorporated lessons learned from the Blackwater Canyon attack, while maintaining the educational value and scientific rigor that made field programs essential for training wildlife professionals. The new standards emphasized risk assessment, emergency preparedness, and communication systems, while avoiding overly restrictive approaches that might limit valuable learning opportunities. Dr. Sarah Hendricks had become involved in developing these improved safety protocols as part of her doctoral research, which had evolved to focus on human-wildlife conflict prevention and wilderness safety education. Her first-hand experience as both an attack survivor and a wildlife researcher had provided unique insights into the practical challenges of balancing safety concerns with educational objectives. Her work had contributed to developing risk assessment tools and decision-making frameworks that could help future research programs avoid the conditions that had led to the Blackwater Canyon attack. The challenge is to learn from our experience without becoming so risk-averse that we lose the educational value of field programs, Sarah explained during her presentation at the annual Wildlife Society conference. Wilderness research involves inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated, but we can significantly reduce the probability of dangerous encounters through better planning, preparation, and real-time decision-making. The key is maintaining respect for wildlife, while continuing to provide the hands-on learning experiences that are essential for training effective wildlife professionals. Sarah's recovery had progressed well enough that she had been able to return to fieldwork 6 months after the attack, though her approach to research had been fundamentally changed by her survival experience. Her first post-attack field season had been conducted with enhanced safety protocols and increased awareness of environmental factors that might indicate elevated risk for wildlife encounters. She had also incorporated psychological preparation and stress management techniques that helped her maintain effectiveness while managing the hypervigilance and anxiety responses that persisted as lingering effects of her trauma. The annual reunion of the Blackwater Canyon attack survivors had become an important tradition that served both social and therapeutic functions for the group. Their first reunion, held 1 year after the attack at a conference facility in Helena, had provided an opportunity to share updates on their recovery progress, discuss ongoing challenges, and maintain the bonds that had been forged during their shared ordeal. The gathering had included presentations by each survivor about their personal recovery journey and professional developments influenced by their experience. Our shared experience has created a connection that goes beyond normal professional relationships, Dr. Thompson explained during the reunion's opening session. We survived something together that very few people have experienced, and that shared knowledge and mutual support has become an important resource for our ongoing personal and professional development. This annual gathering helps us maintain those connections while honoring the experience that changed all of our lives. The reunion had also served as a forum for sharing lessons learned and best practices that could benefit other wildlife professionals working in dangerous environments. Each survivor had developed specialized expertise based on their role during the attack and their subsequent recovery experience, creating a collective knowledge base that had proven valuable for training programs, safety protocol development, and psychological support for other trauma survivors. Jennifer Martinez's presentation at the reunion had focused on her physical and psychological recovery from the most severe injuries sustained in the attack. Her journey from critical injury to full return to active duty as a park ranger had required 18 months of intensive rehabilitation and had provided valuable insights into the long-term recovery process for serious wildlife attack injuries. Her experience had influenced treatment protocols for future bear attack victims and had contributed to improved understanding of the psychological challenges faced by wilderness professionals who have survived life-threatening encounters. The most difficult aspect of my recovery was not the physical injuries, but rebuilding confidence in my ability to work safely in bear habitat, Martinez explained. My career had been built around expertise in bear behavior and conflict prevention, so surviving an attack despite following established safety protocols created fundamental questions about my professional competence and the reliability of safety systems that I had taught to others for 15 years. Her return to active duty had required extensive psychological preparation and gradual reintroduction to bear management responsibilities, starting with office duties and progressing through carefully supervised field assignments before returning to full operational status. Her experience had contributed to developing support protocols for other rangers and wildlife professionals who had experienced traumatic incidents during their careers, helping them maintain their professional effectiveness while processing their psychological responses to dangerous encounters. The research station's continued operation and enhanced safety protocols had demonstrated that the attack had not permanently compromised the educational mission that brought wildlife professionals to the Helena National Forest. The facility's reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by the professional response to the crisis and the valuable lessons learned from the incident. Enrollment in research programs had actually increased following the attack, as the facilities demonstrated competence in emergency response and crisis management had attracted participants who valued thorough preparation and professional risk management. Dr. Marcus Thompson had continued as Director of Research Programs at Blackwater Canyon, though his approach to safety management had been fundamentally influenced by his experience in leading the group's survival and evacuation efforts. His leadership during the crisis had become a case study in wilderness emergency management that was taught in leadership development programs for park rangers, military personnel, and emergency responders. His ability to maintain tactical discipline and coordinate complex rescue operations under extreme stress had demonstrated the value of experience and preparation in crisis situations. The bear responsible for the attack had never been definitively located despite extensive search efforts, though several large male grizzlies in the area had been monitored using GPS collar technology and DNA sampling to determine if any might have been the attacking animal. Wildlife managers had concluded that the bear had either died naturally, moved to a different area, or had learned to avoid human detection following the incident. No additional aggressive encounters had been reported in the Blackwater Canyon area, suggesting that whatever factors had triggered the original attack were no longer present. The long-term impact of the Blackwater Canyon attack extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence wilderness safety practices, wildlife management policies, and emergency response protocols throughout North America. The incident had provided valuable data about human-grizzly bear interactions during a critical period when bear populations were recovering in many areas and when increasing numbers of people were using bear habitat for recreation and research activities. The lessons learned from the attack had contributed to improved safety standards that had likely prevented additional attacks and saved lives among wilderness users. Dr. Sarah Hendricks completed her doctoral dissertation on human-wildlife conflict prevention 3 years after the attack, incorporating extensive analysis of the Blackwater Canyon incident and its implications for wildlife management and wilderness safety education. Her research had contributed to developing predictive models for bear attack risk assessment and had influenced safety protocol development for research programs throughout bear habitat. Her first-hand experience as both an attack survivor and a wildlife researcher had provided unique credibility and insight that enhanced the practical value of her academic work. The psychological support network that had developed among the attack survivors had expanded to include other wildlife attack survivors and wilderness trauma victims, creating a resource that provided peer counseling and support for people who had experienced similar life-threatening encounters. The network had been formalized as a non-profit organization that provided training for wilderness safety instructors, emergency responders, and mental health professionals working with trauma survivors. The organization's work had been funded through grants from wilderness medicine foundations and had contributed to improved outcomes for wilderness trauma victims throughout North America. The annual memorial service for the Blackwater Canyon attack, held each year on the anniversary of the incident, had become an important tradition that honored both the survivors' experience and the broader community of wilderness professionals who accepted significant risks in their work to protect and study wildlife. The service included representatives from multiple agencies, academic institutions, and conservation organizations, creating a forum for sharing lessons learned and maintaining awareness of the risks and rewards associated with working in dangerous wilderness environments. The legacy of the Blackwater Canyon attack continued to influence wilderness safety education, wildlife management practices, and emergency response protocols more than 5 years after the incident occurred. The survivors' ongoing work in safety education, trauma counseling, and wildlife research had ensured that the lessons learned from their ordeal continued to benefit new generations of wilderness professionals and outdoor recreation enthusiasts. Their shared experience had demonstrated that survival of the most dangerous wildlife encounters was possible through proper preparation, training, and teamwork, while also acknowledging that some risks could never be completely eliminated from wilderness activities. The story of the Blackwater Canyon mauling had become more than an account of survival against one of nature's most powerful predators. It had become a testament to human resilience, the value of preparation and training, and the importance of maintaining respect for wildlife while pursuing the scientific knowledge and wilderness experiences that enrich our understanding of the natural world. The 12 individuals who had faced death together on that spring afternoon in the Montana wilderness had emerged not only as survivors, but as teachers whose hard-won knowledge would help protect others who ventured into the domain of the grizzly bear. The next stories: Grizzly attacks hospital loading dock, injures 4 staff, June 29, 2024. The security camera timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when Patricia Patty Morrison first noticed something was wrong. The veteran night shift nurse had been working at St. Luke's Regional Medical Center in Missoula, Montana, for 23 years, long enough to trust her instincts when they screamed danger. She paused mid-stride in the sterile corridor leading to the loading dock, her Nike sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum as the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Outside, the late June air hung thick with the promise of summer storms, and the surrounding Bitterroot Mountains loomed dark against the star-scattered sky. Missoula had been experiencing an unusual drought that spring, driving wildlife closer to urban areas in search of water and food. The hospital's location on the western edge of the city, where manicured lawns gave way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings, made it a natural corridor for animals moving between the Rattlesnake Wilderness and the Clark Fork River Valley. Patty Morrison was 54 years old, a stocky woman with prematurely grey hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind brown eyes that had seen everything the emergency department could throw at her. She had 2 grown children living in Seattle and a husband who worked the early shift at the Stimson lumber mill. Her routine was as predictable as clockwork. Arrive at 11 p.m., check in with the day shift supervisor, conduct her rounds, and supervise the late-night supply delivery that arrived every Saturday without fail. The supply truck from Intermountain Medical Distribution had been coming to St. Luke's for over a decade, driven by the same 2 men who knew the loading dock protocol by heart. Tonight, however, something felt fundamentally different. The usual sounds of boxes being moved and the hydraulic whine of the lift gate seemed muffled, replaced by an odd scraping noise that didn't belong. Patty pushed through the heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and stepped onto the loading dock's concrete platform. The harsh fluorescent lights created pools of stark white illumination that made the shadows beyond seem impenetrably black. The delivery truck, a white freightliner with the Intermountain Medical logo emblazoned on its side, sat with its rear doors open like a mechanical mouth exhaling boxes and medical equipment. 26-year-old Marcus Williams was wrestling with a particularly heavy crate of IV fluids when he first felt eyes watching him. Marcus had been working the delivery route for 3 years, ever since graduating from the University of Montana with a degree in logistics that he'd never quite figured out how to use. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped black hair and the kind of easy smile that made him popular with the hospital staff. His partner, 51-year-old Randy Coleman, was somewhere in the truck's cargo bay, probably counting inventory sheets by the light of his headlamp. Randy Coleman was a Montana native, born and raised in the Bitterroot Valley before it became fashionable for celebrities and tech moguls to buy ranches there. He'd been driving trucks for Intermountain Medical for 15 years, long enough to know every pothole and speed trap between Billings and Coeur d'Alene. Randy was shorter than Marcus, but built like a fire hydrant, with hands that could handle a 200-pound medical cabinet like it weighed 20 pounds. He'd been married to the same woman for 28 years, had 3 kids and 5 grandchildren, and knew these late-night hospital runs like other people knew their morning commute. The 4th member of their small group was Tommy Chen, a 23-year-old orderly who'd been working at St. Luke's for just 8 months. Tommy was the youngest of 4 children born to Taiwanese immigrants who'd opened a successful restaurant in Missoula's downtown district. He was working the hospital job to pay his way through pre-med courses at the university, carrying a perfect GPA while supporting himself with night shifts that left his days free for studying. Tommy stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, but possessed the kind of wiry strength that came from years of martial arts training and an obsessive dedication to physical fitness. The bear had been watching them for nearly 20 minutes. Hidden in the tree line approximately 70 yards from the loading dock, the massive grizzly remained perfectly still, its dark brown fur blending seamlessly with the shadows between the ponderosa pines and Douglas fir. This was not a typical Ursus arctos horribilis. At nearly 8 feet tall when standing on its hind legs and weighing close to 600 pounds, it was a mature male, probably 15 to 20 years old, with the silver-tipped fur that gave grizzlies their name and the distinctive shoulder hump that marked it as one of North America's apex predators. The bear's presence in this location was unprecedented but not inexplicable. The severe drought had dramatically reduced the huckleberry crop in the high country, and the salmon runs in the Clark Fork had been poor due to low water levels. Urban interface zones like this, where human development met wild habitat, had become crucial foraging areas for stressed wildlife. The hospital's location, adjacent to the Mount Jumbo Trail System and the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area, made it part of a natural wildlife corridor that animals had used for generations. More troubling was the bear's behavior. Rather than the typical food-seeking pattern of most urban bears, this animal displayed signs of territorial aggression mixed with curiosity about human activity. Its body language, ears forward, head raised, deliberately stepping closer every few minutes, suggested an animal that was both assessing the situation and gradually escalating its engagement with the humans it was observing. Patty Morrison stepped fully onto the loading dock and called out to Marcus, who was still struggling with the heavy crate. "Need some help there, hun?" Her voice carried easily across the dock, but something in the quality of the sound made her pause. The usual ambient noise of the city, distant traffic on Reserve Street, the hum of air conditioning units, the occasional siren, seemed strangely muted. Marcus looked up gratefully, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove. "This one's a bear," he said, not realizing how prophetic his words would prove to be. "Randy's got the dolly somewhere in the truck." From inside the cargo bay, Randy's voice echoed hollowly. "Coming right up. Tommy, you grab that end." Tommy Chen emerged from the truck, carrying a lightweight aluminum dolly, his slight frame moving with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to maximize leverage and momentum to compensate for his size. He'd been working steadily for the past hour, moving boxes from the truck to the hospital's storage areas with the methodical precision he applied to everything in his life. The bear chose that moment to move. It wasn't the charging rush that people typically associate with bear attacks. Instead, the grizzly stepped out of the forest with the deliberate confidence of an animal that had made its decision. Its massive paws made no sound on the asphalt of the parking lot as it approached the loading dock, keeping to the shadows between the parked cars and staying downwind of the humans. Patty saw it first. A dark shape moving with impossible fluid grace between a Honda Civic and a Ford pickup truck. For a moment her brain simply refused to process what her eyes were telling her. Bears didn't wander into hospital parking lots. Bears didn't approach groups of humans engaged in noisy activity under bright lights. Bears stayed in the wilderness where they belonged. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of boxes being moved. The bear was now less than 30 yards away, moving with the rolling gait that could cover ground faster than a human could run. Its small, dark eyes were fixed on the loading dock with the kind of intense focus that predators reserve for prey. Marcus, still bent over the heavy crate, didn't hear Patty's whispered exclamation. Randy was somewhere deep in the truck's cargo bay. Tommy had his back turned, organizing supplies on the dolly. None of them understood that they were being hunted. Patty Morrison's 23 years of emergency room experience kicked in. She'd seen enough trauma to know that the next few seconds would determine whether her colleagues lived or died. Her voice, when it came, carried the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "Bear! Everybody move! Now!" Marcus Williams's head snapped up so fast he felt his neck crack. His first thought was that Patty was making some kind of joke about the heavy crate, but the terror in her voice killed that notion immediately. He turned to look in the direction of her pointing finger and felt his blood turn to ice water. The grizzly was running now, covering the remaining distance to the loading dock with the deceptive speed that made these animals so dangerous. At full sprint, a grizzly bear can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human has ever run. This bear was not quite at full sprint, but it was moving with deadly intent, its massive claws clicking against the asphalt. Tommy Chen's martial arts training saved his life. Without consciously thinking about it, he dropped into a defensive crouch and spun toward the threat, his body automatically seeking the most advantageous position. What he saw sent a surge of adrenaline through his system that made his vision sharpen and his hearing become preternaturally acute. Every detail became hyper-real. The bear's silver-tipped fur catching the fluorescent light, the way its ears were laid back against its skull, the massive claws that scraped sparks from the concrete as it reached the base of the loading dock. Randy Coleman was still inside the truck when he heard Patty's scream. His first instinct was to grab for the emergency air horn he kept in the cab for exactly this kind of situation. But the bear was moving too fast, and Randy was too deep in the cargo bay to reach it in time. The loading dock stood 4 feet above the parking lot, a height that would challenge most animals. The grizzly cleared it in a single, fluid motion that spoke of incredible power and coordination. It landed on the concrete platform with a sound like thunder, its 600 pounds of muscle and bone striking the ground with enough force to send vibrations through the building's steel frame. Marcus Williams found himself face to face with 6 inches of yellowed claws and a mouth full of teeth designed to crush bone. The bear's breath was hot and rank with the smell of carrion, and its eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than mindless animal rage. This was not a panicked creature defending itself. This was a predator that had made a calculated decision to attack. Marcus did the only thing his terror-frozen brain could think of. He threw the heavy crate of IV fluids directly at the bear's face. The 40-pound box struck the grizzly in the muzzle with enough force to snap its head back, buying Marcus precious seconds to scramble backward toward the hospital's steel door. The bear's response was swift and devastating. One massive paw swept through the air where Marcus had been standing, claws extended, moving with enough force to decapitate a man. The strike missed Marcus by inches, but connected with the concrete wall of the building, gouging 4 parallel furrows in the masonry that looked like they'd been cut with a chisel. Patty Morrison had reached the steel door and was frantically swiping her keycard through the electronic lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the plastic card steady. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of chaos as her colleagues tried to avoid the bear's attacks. The electronic lock seemed to take forever to respond, the red light blinking mockingly before finally turning green with a soft beep that was almost drowned out by the sound of snarling. Tommy Chen was not running. His martial arts training had taught him that turning your back on a predator was often fatal, and his analytical mind was already calculating angles and distances. The bear was focused on Marcus, who was trapped between the animal and the truck. If Tommy could create a distraction, Marcus might be able to escape. Tommy grabbed the aluminum dolly and swung it like a weapon, the lightweight metal frame making a satisfying crack as it connected with the bear's flank. The impact would have staggered a human, but the grizzly barely seemed to notice. Instead, It turned its attention to this new threat with the swift decisiveness of a creature that had evolved to deal with multiple dangers simultaneously. The bear's backhand swipe caught Tommy across the chest with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him flying backward into the truck's rear bumper. The young man's body struck the metal with a sickening thud, and he slumped to the concrete, blood already staining his scrubs. But he was still conscious, still moving, and still thinking clearly enough to realize that the bear was now standing between him and any possible escape route. Marcus had reached the partially open door where Patty was trying to pull him inside, but the bear's attack on Tommy had caused it to move in their direction. Now the massive animal stood less than 10 feet away, its attention divided between the injured orderly and the two people trying to escape through the doorway. Randy Coleman finally reached the truck's cab and laid on the air horn, the piercing blast echoing off the hospital's walls like a ship's fog signal. The sound was loud enough to be heard for miles, and Randy held it down continuously, hoping to either scare off the bear or attract help. The horn's wail mixed with the sound of his own voice screaming for security, creating a cacophony that should have sent any normal animal fleeing. The grizzly, however, was not behaving like any normal animal. Instead of retreating from the loud noise, it seemed to become more agitated, its movements becoming more erratic and aggressive. It spun toward the truck, then back toward Tommy, then toward the doorway where Marcus and Patty were struggling to get inside. The attack that followed would be reconstructed later from security camera footage, witness statements and forensic evidence. But for those experiencing it, time seemed to move in a series of disconnected snapshots, each frozen moment burned into memory with crystalline clarity. The bear chose Tommy Chen as its primary target, perhaps because the young man was isolated and vulnerable, or perhaps because his defiant stand with the dolly had marked him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The grizzly's charge covered the 12 feet between them in less than 2 seconds, its massive bulk moving with the devastating efficiency of a natural-born killer. Tommy tried to roll away, but there was nowhere to go. The truck's rear bumper was behind him, the loading dock's edge to his left, and the bear coming straight at him. His martial arts training had prepared him for human opponents, not 600-pound apex predators with claws like railroad spikes. The bear's first strike caught Tommy in the shoulder, 4 claws raking through flesh and muscle like it was tissue paper. The young man's scream was cut short as the impact drove the air from his lungs, but he somehow managed to twist away from the follow-up attack that would have opened his throat. Patty Morrison had finally gotten the door open and was pulling Marcus inside when she saw Tommy go down. Every instinct told her to get inside and lock the door, but 23 years of nursing had ingrained in her a response to human suffering that overrode her own survival instincts. She released her grip on Marcus and grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy flashlight from the emergency kit by the door, and ran back toward the bear. "Get away from him!" she screamed, striking the bear across the muzzle with the flashlight. The blow would have knocked out a human, but it only seemed to anger the grizzly further. The animal's head swiveled toward her with predatory focus, and Patty found herself looking into eyes that held no recognition of her humanity. The bear's swipe caught Patty across the ribs, launching her backward with enough force to slam her into the hospital's brick wall. She felt something crack in her chest, ribs probably, and tasted blood in her mouth. But she was still conscious and still moving. The bear had turned its attention back to Tommy, who was trying to crawl away, despite the massive wounds in his shoulder. Marcus Williams had reached the safety of the doorway, but couldn't bring himself to abandon his colleagues. He grabbed the emergency phone mounted just inside the door and dialed 911, his voice cracking as he tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. "St. Luke's Hospital loading dock," he gasped into the phone. "Bear attack. People hurt. Send everything." The 911 dispatcher, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had been handling emergency calls for Missoula County for 7 years, initially thought she was dealing with either a prank call or someone experiencing a psychiatric emergency. Bear attacks in hospital parking lots simply didn't happen. But Marcus's voice carried a level of genuine terror that couldn't be faked, and she could hear screaming and what sounded like an air horn in the background. "Sir, did you say a bear attack at St. Luke's Hospital?" Jennifer asked, already dispatching units even as she struggled to believe what she was hearing. "Grizzly bear," Marcus confirmed, watching through the doorway as the massive animal continued its assault on Tommy Chen. "It's killing them! Please hurry!" The bear's second attack on Tommy was more systematic than the first. The animal pinned the young man to the concrete with one massive paw on his chest, then began raking its claws across his legs and torso with the methodical precision of a predator that knew exactly how to disable its prey. Tommy's screams echoed off the hospital walls, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who heard it. Randy Coleman had climbed out of the truck through the passenger side door and was trying to circle around to help, but the bear stood between him and his colleagues. He had grabbed a tire iron from the truck's toolkit, a pathetically inadequate weapon against an animal that could decapitate a moose with a single swipe. Patty Morrison was trying to get back to her feet, her vision blurry from the impact with the wall. She could see Tommy's blood spreading across the concrete in an expanding pool, could hear his weakening cries for help, and knew that without immediate intervention, the young man would bleed to death on the loading dock. The first police unit arrived exactly 7 minutes after Marcus's call, sirens wailing as Officer Sarah Martinez's patrol car roared into the hospital parking lot. Sarah Martinez was a 6-year veteran of the Missoula Police Department, a tough, competent woman who had dealt with everything from domestic violence to drug raids. But she had never faced a grizzly bear in the middle of a hospital complex. What she saw when she got out of her patrol car challenged every assumption she had about police work. The loading dock was bathed in blood and lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made the scene look like something from a horror movie. A massive grizzly bear stood over what appeared to be a severely injured young man, while other people cowered in doorways and behind vehicles. Officer Martinez's training kicked in immediately. She drew her service weapon, a Glock 22 loaded with .40 caliber hollow point rounds, and took a shooting stance behind her patrol car's open door. Bears were not unknown in Missoula, but they were usually handled by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel with specialized equipment. Sarah Martinez had standard police ammunition, designed for human targets, not 600-pound carnivores. "Get back from the animal," she shouted, though she wasn't sure if the people could hear her over the ongoing chaos. The bear looked up at her voice, blood matting the fur around its muzzle, and Sarah felt a chill of recognition that this was not a normal wildlife encounter. This animal was displaying aggressive territorial behavior that suggested it saw humans as either prey or competitors. The bear left Tommy Chen and began moving toward Officer Martinez with the same deliberate confidence it had shown earlier. Sarah had perhaps 15 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether more people died that night. Shooting a grizzly bear was not like shooting a human. The animal's skull was designed to withstand impacts that would kill most other creatures. Its vital organs were protected by muscle and fat that could absorb tremendous damage, and its nervous system was wired for survival in ways that defied human understanding. Sarah Martinez fired 6 rounds in rapid succession, each shot aimed at the center of the bear's mass. The .40 caliber rounds struck home, causing the grizzly to stumble and roar with a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. But the bear did not go down. Instead, it turned toward this new source of pain and began charging directly at the police officer. The charging grizzly covered the 30 yards between the loading dock and the patrol car in less than 4 seconds. Sarah Martinez fired her remaining rounds as the bear approached, but 600 pounds of enraged carnivore cannot be stopped by handgun fire alone. The bear struck the patrol car's front end with enough force to deploy the airbags, crushing the hood and pushing the vehicle backward across the asphalt. Officer Martinez threw herself sideways as the bear landed on her patrol car, its claws screeching against metal and glass. She hit the ground hard, her radio crackling with urgent communications from dispatch as other units responded to her shots-fired call. The bear slid off the crushed patrol car and stood for a moment, blood streaming from multiple wounds, looking around the parking lot with the confused rage of an animal that was hurt but not defeated. Tommy Chen had lost consciousness from blood loss and trauma, his body lying motionless in the spreading pool of his own blood. Patty Morrison, despite her injuries, was crawling toward him across the concrete, her nurse's instincts overriding her own pain. Marcus Williams remained in the doorway, talking frantically to the 911 dispatcher and trying to guide additional emergency units to the scene. Randy Coleman saw his chance when the bear's attention was focused on the destroyed police car. He sprinted across the loading dock toward Tommy, the tire iron still clutched in his hands. Randy had no medical training, but he could see that the young man was bleeding to death and needed immediate help. "Tommy!" Randy called out as he reached the injured orderly. "Stay with me, kid!" "Help's coming!" The bear heard Randy's voice and turned away from the patrol car wreckage. Its wounds were beginning to slow it down, but the animal was still capable of delivering lethal attacks. It began moving toward Randy and the unconscious Tommy with the relentless determination of a predator that would not be denied its kill. Patty Morrison reached them first, her hands immediately going to Tommy's wounds in an attempt to control the bleeding. His shoulder was laid open to the bone, and she could see several deep gashes on his legs that had severed what looked like major blood vessels. Without immediate surgical intervention and massive blood transfusion, Tommy Chen was going to die on the loading dock of the hospital where he worked. "We need to get him inside," Patty gasped to Randy. Her own breathing labored from her cracked ribs. "Pressure on the wounds. We need towels, blankets, anything to stop this bleeding." The bear was now less than 20 feet away, moving more slowly due to its wounds, but still utterly determined to finish what it had started. Randy Coleman stood up and faced the animal with nothing but a tire iron and the kind of desperate courage that emerges when there's no other choice. "Come on, then," he said quietly, raising the tire iron like a baseball bat. "Let's finish this." The second wave of emergency responders arrived just as the bear reached Randy Coleman. A Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks truck roared into the parking lot, followed closely by 2 additional police units and an ambulance. The wildlife officer, a 20-year veteran named Dale Peterson, immediately sized up the situation and grabbed his dart rifle from the truck's equipment rack. Dale Peterson had been dealing with problem bears for his entire career, but he had never seen anything like this. Grizzly bears simply did not attack groups of humans in well-lit urban areas without extreme provocation. This animal's behavior suggested either rabies, which was virtually unknown in grizzly populations, or some kind of neurological damage that was affecting its normal survival instincts. The tranquilizer dart struck the bear in the hindquarters just as it reared up on its hind legs to attack Randy Coleman. The immobilizing drug, a mixture of telazol and xylazine, would take several minutes to take effect, but the impact of the dart caused the bear to swing around toward this new threat. Randy Coleman used the distraction to grab Tommy Chen under the arms and begin dragging him toward the hospital entrance, leaving a trail of blood across the concrete. Patty Morrison helped as much as her injuries allowed, applying pressure to Tommy's wounds while they moved him to safety. The bear, now with a tranquilizer dart protruding from its flank and multiple gunshot wounds slowing its movements, began to show signs of the drug's effects. Its coordination became unsteady, and its aggressive behavior started to give way to confusion and disorientation. Dale Peterson fired a second dart to ensure the animal would be fully immobilized, then radioed for a wildlife transport unit. Even wounded and drugged, a grizzly bear remained dangerous until it was completely unconscious. The ambulance crew, led by paramedic Lisa Chen, no relation to Tommy, immediately went to work on the most severely injured victim. Tommy Chen's vital signs were barely detectable when they reached him, his blood pressure having dropped to dangerous levels due to massive blood loss. "We need to move him now," Lisa told her partner Jim Rodriguez as they loaded Tommy onto a stretcher. "He's not going to make it if we don't get him into surgery in the next 10 minutes. Patty Morrison refused treatment until she had given the paramedics a complete rundown of Tommy's injuries and her assessment of his condition. Despite her own trauma, cracked ribs, a concussion, and numerous cuts and bruises, her primary concern was for her young colleague. "Deep lacerations to the right shoulder with probable arterial involvement," she reported in the clinical language of her profession. "Multiple puncture wounds to the torso and extremities. Estimated blood loss approximately 40% of total volume. He's been unconscious for at least 8 minutes." Officer Sarah Martinez had suffered a dislocated shoulder and multiple contusions when she dove away from the charging bear, but she was conscious and coherent. As soon as the paramedics cleared her for duty, she began coordinating the crime scene investigation and witness interviews. Marcus Williams was physically uninjured but showed signs of severe psychological trauma. He kept repeating his 911 call to anyone who would listen, as if the repetition could somehow make sense of what had happened. Randy Coleman had minor cuts and bruises but was otherwise unhurt, though he stayed close to the ambulance until he was sure Tommy Chen was going to receive proper medical care. The bear finally collapsed at 12:23 a.m., exactly 36 minutes after the attack began. Dale Peterson and his team immediately began the process of securing and transporting the animal for necropsy and testing. The preliminary examination revealed multiple gunshot wounds, none of them individually fatal, and no obvious signs of disease or injury that might explain the animal's unprecedented behavior. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, St. Luke's Chief of Emergency Medicine, was waiting in Trauma Bay 1 when the ambulance arrived with Tommy Chen. Dr. Harper was a veteran of 15 years in emergency medicine, with extensive experience treating everything from car accidents to gunshot wounds, but she had never worked on a bear attack victim. "What do we have?" she asked, as the paramedics wheeled Tommy into the trauma bay. 23-year-old male, bear attack victim, Lisa Chen reported. Multiple deep lacerations, severe blood loss, unconscious for approximately 15 minutes. We've got 2 large-bore IVS running lactated ringers, but his pressure's still dropping. Dr. Harper's examination revealed the extent of Tommy's injuries. 4 deep claw marks across his right shoulder that had severed the axillary artery, multiple puncture wounds to his chest and abdomen, and severe lacerations to both legs. He had lost an estimated 60% of his blood volume and was in hypovolemic shock. "Get me 4 units of O-negative blood and call Dr. Martinez in surgery," Dr. Harper ordered. "This kid's going to need immediate surgical repair of that arterial injury, and we need to make sure there's no internal bleeding from those puncture wounds." The surgery lasted 4.5 hours. Dr. Roberto Martinez, St. Luke's Chief of Vascular Surgery, worked to repair the severed axillary artery, while Dr. Harper and her team addressed the other injuries. Tommy Chen required 12 units of blood, making his case one of the most severe trauma cases the hospital had seen in years. Patty Morrison was treated and released with pain medication and strict instructions to return if she experienced any worsening of her symptoms. Her cracked ribs would heal, but the psychological trauma would take much longer to address. She asked to be kept informed of Tommy's condition and insisted on visiting him as soon as he was stable enough to receive visitors. The investigation into the bear attack began immediately, led by Detective Ray Morrison, no relation to Patty, of the Missoula Police Department, and Dale Peterson from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. The attack site was processed like any other crime scene, with measurements, photographs, and physical evidence collected for analysis. The security camera footage provided crucial evidence about the bear's behavior before and during the attack. The animal had been observing the loading dock for nearly 20 minutes before attacking, behavior that was highly unusual for a wild grizzly. Most bears that wander into urban areas are either young animals seeking territory or older animals that have been displaced by human activity. This bear's systematic stalking suggested something more troubling. The necropsy, performed by Dr. Sarah Kim at the University of Montana's Wildlife Laboratory, revealed several disturbing findings. The bear was an adult male, approximately 18 years old, in excellent physical condition except for the gunshot wounds that had ultimately brought it down. Tests for rabies came back negative, as did screening for other diseases that might affect behavior. More concerning were the traces of various chemicals found in the bear's tissue samples. Analysis revealed elevated levels of several compounds associated with industrial pollution, including heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants that could affect neurological function. The bear's home range appeared to include areas near several abandoned mining sites in the Bitterroot Mountains, where environmental contamination was a known issue. Dr. Kim's report concluded that while the chemical contamination might have contributed to the bear's abnormal behavior, it was impossible to establish a definitive causal relationship. The attack remained an unprecedented event in Montana's wildlife management records. The media coverage of the attack was intense and immediate. By dawn on June 30th, news crews from Missoula, Helena, and even national networks were setting up outside St. Luke's Hospital. The story of a grizzly bear attacking hospital workers at a major medical facility was exactly the kind of dramatic incident that captured public attention. Local news anchor Jennifer Walsh, the same dispatcher who had taken Marcus's initial 911 call, though this coincidence went largely unnoticed, reported live from the hospital parking lot as maintenance crews worked to clean up the blood and repair the damaged loading dock. The story led every newscast in Montana and was picked up by national networks as a human interest piece. A routine supply delivery turned into a nightmare at St. Luke's Regional Medical Center last night, Walsh reported, standing in front of the police tape that still surrounded the loading dock. 4 hospital employees were injured when a large grizzly bear wandered onto hospital property and attacked without warning. The coverage inevitably led to questions about wildlife management policies and the safety of the urban wildland interface zones that surrounded Missoula. Environmental groups argued that habitat loss and climate change were forcing wildlife into increasing contact with human populations, while hunting advocates suggested that grizzly bear populations had grown too large and needed to be controlled more aggressively. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a wildlife biologist at the University of Montana who had not been directly involved in the investigation, offered a more nuanced perspective in an interview with the Missoulian newspaper. This appears to be a highly unusual incident that doesn't fit the normal patterns of human-bear conflict. Grizzly bears are typically very risk-averse when it comes to humans, especially in groups and well-lit areas. Something about this situation was fundamentally different. Tommy Chen remained in critical condition for 3 days following the surgery. His parents, David and Mary Chen, maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, supported by the extended family from their restaurant and a steady stream of visitors from the hospital staff. The young man's determination to become a doctor had made him popular among his colleagues, and his heroic actions during the attack had only enhanced their respect for him. On the fourth day, Tommy opened his eyes and asked for water. His first coherent question was about the other victims, Patty Morrison, Marcus Williams, and Randy Coleman. When assured that everyone had survived, he closed his eyes and slept for another 12 hours, the first peaceful sleep he'd had since the attack. The psychological impact of the attack affected all the survivors differently. Marcus Williams developed severe anxiety about working night shifts and eventually transferred to a day position with a different medical supply company. The loading dock at St. Luke's, he felt, would forever be associated with the most terrifying night of his life. Randy Coleman returned to work after a 2-week leave, but found himself constantly scanning the tree line whenever he made deliveries to rural locations. His wife, Martha, noticed that he had become hyper-vigilant about security around their home, installing motion sensor lights and keeping a shotgun by the bed for the first time in their marriage. Patty Morrison struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering if she could have done more to prevent the attack or protect her colleagues. She began seeing a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery and gradually worked through the complex emotions surrounding the incident. Her experience as a nurse helped her understand the healing process, but understanding and experiencing were very different things. For Tommy Chen, the physical recovery was only part of the challenge. The young man, who had been pursuing a career in medicine, now faced the possibility of permanent nerve damage to his right arm that could affect his ability to perform surgery. Physical therapy sessions became a daily routine as he worked to regain full function of his injured shoulder. The financial impact of the attack was substantial. Tommy's medical bills exceeded $200,000. Though most costs were covered by the hospital's workers' compensation insurance and additional coverage provided by the community fundraising effort that emerged in the wake of the attack. The Chen family's restaurant became an unofficial coordination center for the fundraising campaign, with regular customers contributing both money and moral support. St. Luke's Hospital implemented new security protocols in response to the attack, including motion sensor cameras around the loading dock and an emergency alert system that could summon security personnel immediately. The hospital also contracted with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to provide regular wildlife assessments of the property and recommendations for deterring animals from the area. The loading dock itself was redesigned with higher walls and additional lighting, though some staff members remained uncomfortable working in the area, especially during night shifts. A memorial plaque was installed near the entrance, honoring the courage of the 4 employees who had faced the bear and survived. Dale Peterson continued his investigation into the unusual behavior of the attack bear, working with university researchers to analyze the relationship between environmental contamination and wildlife behavior. His findings contributed to a broader study of human-wildlife conflict in the northern Rocky Mountains, research that would inform policy decisions for years to come. 6 months after the attack, Tommy Chen returned to work at St. Luke's Hospital, though in a different capacity. The nerve damage to his shoulder had healed sufficiently to allow normal function, but he had decided to change his career focus from surgery to emergency medicine. His experience as a trauma victim had given him unique insights into patient care that would serve him well throughout his medical career. The grizzly bear that had attacked them was never forgotten. Taxidermied and displayed at the University of Montana's Wildlife Museum, it became part of an educational exhibit about human-wildlife conflict and the complex challenges of conservation in the modern world. A placard beneath the display told the story of the attack and honored the courage of the hospital workers who had survived it. Dr. Elizabeth Harper often brought medical students to see the bear exhibit as part of their trauma medicine training. "This is what we prepare for," she would tell them, gesturing at the massive mounted animal. "Not just the medical challenges, but the human element. The courage, the fear, the split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. Indeed, the case became part of the medical literature, written up in the Journal of Trauma Medicine as an example of successful treatment of severe wildlife attack injuries. Tommy Chen, now Dr. Thomas Chen, was listed as a co-author on the paper, his transition from victim to medical professional complete. On quiet nights at St. Luke's Hospital, when the loading dock is lit by the same fluorescent lights and the mountains loom dark against the sky, staff members sometimes pause to remember the night that changed everything. The new security measures have prevented any similar incidents, but the memory of that June evening serves as a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary. Patty Morrison, now a supervisor in the emergency department, makes it a point to tell new employees about the bear attack, not to frighten them, but to emphasize the importance of situational awareness and teamwork. "We take care of each other here," she tells them. "When things go bad, we don't leave anyone behind." Marcus Williams never returned to medical supply delivery, instead opening a small auto repair shop in Hamilton, Montana, where the closest thing to dangerous wildlife is the occasional deer in the parking lot. He keeps a framed photograph of Tommy Chen's graduation from medical school on his office wall, a reminder that survival and healing are possible even after the worst trauma. Randy Coleman continued driving trucks until his retirement, though he never again worked the night shift routes to rural hospitals. His grandchildren loved to hear the story of the night he faced down a grizzly bear with nothing but a tire iron, though Martha usually intervenes before he gets to the most frightening parts. The bear attack at St. Luke's Hospital became part of Missoula's local mythology, a story that gets told and retold whenever people gather to talk about close calls and narrow escapes. But for those who lived through it, it remains more than just a story. It's a testament to the courage that ordinary people can display when faced with extraordinary circumstances, and a reminder that in the interface between human civilization and the wild world that surrounds it, anything can happen. The loading dock at St. Luke's Hospital continues to operate every night, with supplies arriving on schedule and staff members going about their duties with professional competence. The mountains still loom dark against the sky, and wildlife still moves through the corridors that connect wilderness to civilization. But now there are protocols in place, lessons learned from a night when the wild came calling at the most unexpected place. In the end, the attack lasted less than 40 minutes from beginning to end, but its impact continues to ripple through the lives it touched. Tommy Chen carries the scars on his shoulder and in his memory, but they have become part of what makes him an exceptional emergency room physician. He has saved hundreds of lives in the years since that night, perhaps more than making up for the trauma he endured. The story of the grizzly bear attack at St. Luke's Hospital serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a reminder that when faced with the unthinkable, human courage and compassion can triumph over the most terrifying circumstances. It stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the bonds that form between people who have shared the ultimate test of survival. Late at night, when the last delivery truck has departed and the loading dock falls quiet, the fluorescent lights continue to shine, casting their harsh illumination over concrete that has been scrubbed clean but will never be free of memory. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the lights, where the developed world meets the wilderness that still surrounds it, life continues its ancient rhythms, occasionally crossing paths with human activity in ways that no one can predict. The bear is gone, mounted now in academic display, but the lessons it taught remain as vivid as ever. That courage comes in many forms, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that sometimes survival depends not on individual heroism, but on the willingness to risk everything for the person standing next to you. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all.